Chapter 1082. What did Yanjing City say? In the conference room of the Yuzhong Sword Committee, the bigwigs of Yuzhong City were having an anxious meeting. Among them were sword spirits of Sinew, sword spirits of Mu Shui, and sword spirits of Tiger Roar. There was also Shi Jueyuan, the head of the Jiandi family. In short, all the bigwigs of Yuzhong City were present. It seemed very normal for these people to appear here, but in fact it was very abnormal. At least when Sword Immortal Baiju Wudao and Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky Lu Lei were in charge of Yuzhong City, these heads of the Jiandi family would not appear in the conference room. If the sword spirits did not hold corresponding positions in the sword committee, they would not appear in the conference room either. In short, when Sword Immortal Baiju Wudao and Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky Sword Immortal held a meeting, they would not be in a hurry to see the person with the highest authority in Yuzhong City. Instead, they would gather officials who held corresponding positions, or people with great professional ability to participate in such a meeting. Only by having a meeting with a professional and capable person could they discuss the most correct solution. And a meeting with these people with the highest authority could only result in endless disputes and compromises for the benefit of all parties. In the end, a solution that took care of everyone's interests but was not the most correct solution. This was something that the past chairman of the Yuzhong Sword Committee had tried their best to avoid. However, because there was a vacancy in Yuzhong City for a Sword Immortal level sword holder, a Sword Immortal level sword holder from Los Angeles became the chairman of Yuzhong City's Sword Committee. This Sword Immortal level sword holder, who had no foundation, could only rely on the help of various forces to manage the entire Yuzhong City. Therefore, these people with the highest authority would inevitably appear at this conference table. Yanjing City said that they are also under great pressure. This time, it is not a large-scale deployment of Yuan Ko. It is only a flood-level Yuan Ko, which does not meet the standard of supporting us. Therefore, Yanjing City will not send any forces to help us. This Yuan Ko needs to be taken care of by Yuzhong City ourselves. A person dressed like a secretary said with his head lowered. These shameless things. How dare they play tricks on us at this time? Shi Juyuan cursed, but he could not blame Yanjing City. According to the agreement between the base cities, only when the base city was in danger of destruction, the other base cities would send forces to help the base city. Although the one attacking Yuzhong City right now was a flood-level bandit who had defeated Sword Immortal Ling Su within 10 minutes, there was only one flood-level bandit. Apart from him, there were no other bandit groups attacking Yuzhong City. Therefore, in terms of overall strength, a single flood-level bandit was not enough to force the other base cities to save Yuzhong City. Logically speaking, Yuzhong City shouldn't be afraid of such a flood-level bandit. With the dimensional wall system around Yuzhong City, a flood-level bandit's attack wouldn't be able to break through the defense of the dimensional wall system. This was because the dimensional wall system could constantly absorb the sword essences of other sword bearers and convert these sword essences into its own shield energy. There were tens of thousands of sword bearers in Yuzhong City. Once these sword bearers injected sword essences into the dimensional wall system at the same time, the energy recovered by the dimensional wall system would be far greater than the energy consumed by a flood-level Yuan Ko. The dimensional wall system would not be in any danger of being breached. If the dimensional wall system was not breached, Yuzhong City would naturally be safe. Only when tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Yuan Ko attacked the dimensional wall system at the same time could the replenishment of the sword essences in the dimensional wall system not keep up with the speed of consumption, and there would be the danger of the dimensional wall breaking. Therefore, after this white dragon defeated Sword Immortal Ling Su, Yuzhong City did not pay much attention to it. They only asked the sword-bearers in charge of defending the city wall to inject their sword essences into the dimensional wall system to maintain the dimensional wall's energy at full capacity. This way, after this white dragon attacked for a while and found that it could not wear down the dimensional wall system, it would retreat on its own and not bother Yuzhong City anymore. Since ancient times, similar things had happened like this without exception. But many Yuzhong City was horrified to find that there was a huge problem with their dimensional wall system. This system suddenly could not accept the input of sword essences from other sword bearers. This was no laughing matter. Without the continuous replenishment of the sword essences by the sword bearers, no amount of energy could withstand the continuous attacks of a flood-level Yuan Ko. According to the intensity of this white dragon's attacks, the energy stored in Yuzhong City's dimensional wall system would be exhausted in 3 days at most. Once the energy was exhausted, the outermost dimensional wall system would collapse. Without the protection of the dimensional wall, one could imagine what kind of disaster the people in the ordinary district would suffer. After discovering this, Yuzhong City began to take urgent action. After a series of inspections, they found that there was a problem with the core of Yuzhong City's super-dimensional wall system. 3 years ago, Yuan Ko used the quantum teleportation array to invade the core area. Then, the universe-level Yuan Ko Loki went straight to the control core of Yuzhong City's super-dimensional wall system in an attempt to completely destroy the entire super-dimensional wall system. Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky led his disciple Gohan and the freedom-level Misaka Mikoto to fight Loki in the core area. In the end, they defeated and killed Loki, protecting the safety of Yuzhong City. At that time, the staff also inspected the condition of the control core. They found that apart from a part of the Emperor alloy missing, the control core did not suffer much damage. However, now that the Emperor-type dimensional crystals were almost extinct, it was impossible to repair the lost Emperor alloy. Therefore, after the staff found that the core control area was operating normally, they ignored the lost Emperor alloy. After all, the Emperor alloy was only used to protect the control core. It did not affect the function of the control core. The existence of the Emperor alloy itself did not affect the operation of the super-dimensional wall system. However, the moment of carelessness caused a huge problem. No one would have thought that Imperial alloy was missing a part of its grounding system. Misaka Mikoto's electromagnetic energy still existed in the remaining Imperial alloy. Imperial alloy turned into the world's most expensive battery, storing the energy that Misaka Mikoto had left in the battery. This electricity formed a strong magnetic field that continuously interfered with the internal control system of the Emperor alloy. In the end, part of the system completely collapsed. This collapsed part of the system happened to be the system that received sword elements from other sword holders. This was the reason why Yuzhong City's super-dimensional wall system could no longer replenish sword elements. This was a subtle process. Therefore, the system was still operating 3 years after the end of the battle. However, the day before the arrival of the White Dragon, the system collapsed at the perfect time. To repair the damaged super-dimensional wall system, the super-dimensional wall system had to be shut down. Otherwise, there was no way to repair it. In the past, when faced with such a situation, Yuzhong City would secretly transfer a large number of sword holders back and use their bodies to protect the safety of Yuzhong City. They would then shut down the super-dimensional wall system and repair it as soon as possible. Generally speaking, when the Yuan Ko forces found out that the super-dimensional wall system was shut down for repair, the super-dimensional wall system would have been repaired and reactivated. Now, a flood-level Yuan Ko was outside. How could Yuzhong City shut down the super-dimensional wall system to repair it? They had to find a way to kill or drive away this white dragon. Otherwise, when the super-dimensional wall system collapsed, the other Yuan Ko would realize that there was a big problem with the super-dimensional wall system. Those Yuan Ko who were constantly trying to destroy humanity would not hesitate to launch a large-scale attack on Yuzhong City. By then, the crisis that Yuzhong City would face would probably be even more terrible than 3 years ago. However, Yuzhang City's high-end forces could not deal with this flood-level Yuan Ko. They needed at least 10 or more immortal sword holders or emperor sword holders. However, the other base cities refused to help Yuzhang City because the danger they were facing was not at the lowest level. As a result, the situation had completely formed an endless loop that was difficult to solve. What about London City? When Longsher Jiendi came to Yuzhang City last time, didn't he promise us that he would protect the safety of Yuzhang City? Since Yanjing City could not be counted on, Shi Juyuan could only pin his hopes on Longsher Jiendi. The secretary hesitated for a moment and said, Longsher Jiendi sent a message saying that the 2 flood-level Yuan Ko of the Palace of Heroes are wandering around London City. Once he leaves, he will definitely be attacked by the 2 Yuan Ko, so Longsher Jiendi can't leave. Excuses? These are all excuses, Shi Juyuan said resentfully. The 2 flood-level Yuan Ko of the Palace of Heroes are watching outside London City every day. Did Longsher Jiendi leave London City? I understand. Mu Shui Sword Spirit, who had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Gohan, suddenly screamed, Longsher Jiendi is retaliating against us. Because of that damned Gohan, Longsher Jiendi's crown prince lost face in front of everyone, so Longsher Jiendi also hates our Yuzhang City. That's why he is unwilling to help us. Hey! This kind of thing can't be said without evidence. Longsher Jiendi can't be so petty, the somewhat weak sword immortal Ling Su said. Not necessarily. I think what Mu Shui Sword Spirit said is very reasonable. If Longsher Jiendi doesn't come to us, the root cause is this Gohan. If we can find a way to appease Longsher Jiendi will definitely come to help us, Shi Juyuan said gloomily. Elder Shi, may I ask how you think we can appease Longsher Jiendi? The Tiger Roar Sword Spirit asked in a strange tone. If we can find a way to hand Gohan over to Longsher Jiendi to deal with, then Longsher Jiendi will definitely appease his anger, Shi Juyuan said, as if it was a matter of course. That's good. Now that Gohan has disappeared without a trace, where will you find Gohan and hand him over to Longsher Jiendi? The Tiger Roar Sword Spirit asked again. Well, although Gohan is not here, isn't his disciple still here? Shi Juyuan smiled faintly. Master is in the wrong, and the disciple should naturally bear some responsibility. I think it would be better to let our pavilion master Lucihua go to London to apologize to Longsher Jiendi, and then accept Longsher Jiendi's punishment on behalf of her master. In this way, Longsher Jiendi will have a way out, and will naturally help us. After saying this, Shi Juyuan cast his gaze on Lucihua, who was sitting in the corner without saying a word, like a puppet. Chapter 1083. Pavilion Master Lu Shihua, what do you think? Shi Juyuan looked at Lu Shihua fiercely and asked. What do you mean? Do I have the right to speak in Yuzhang City? Lu Shihua raised his head coldly. Speak. What do you want me to do? It seems that our pavilion master Lu Shihua isn't taking the meeting seriously. How can he be distracted in such an important meeting? Shi Juyuan snorted coldly. It's because of your master's despicable behavior that Longsher Jiendi isn't willing to help us. Therefore, I hope that you can go to London and apologize to Longsher Jiendi on behalf of your master and accept his punishment. This way, Longsher Jiendi will be willing to help us drive away this Yuan Ko. How can you do this? When Lu Shihua heard this, his hair stood on end. Master has been guarding Shanghai Pass for 3 years, and he is the hero who killed the Grand Wizard. Why should the Sword Committee let Master stay in Shanghai Pass for another 3 years? Why should the Sword Spirit stop Master from leaving? Moreover, it was the Sword Spirit who sealed Master's Purple Palace first. Master only retaliated a little. The Sword Spirit of the Gue Palace was in the wrong first. Why should my master apologize to him? Lu Shihua refuted loudly. It's fine if you want me to do this or that, but it's impossible for me to apologize to the Sword Spirit on behalf of my master today. What do you mean the Sword Spirit's fault? It was the Sword Committee's decision to let your master guard Shanghai pass for another 3 years. What right does your master have to refuse the Sword Committee's order? It was your master who didn't obey the order, so the Sword Spirit stopped him. Not only did your master not surrender, but he also tried to resist and humiliated the Sword Spirit. Don't you know that this humiliation is also a humiliation to His Majesty Jiandi? Lu Shihua was so angry that he couldn't speak. That's my master's business, not mine. If you have the ability, ask my master to apologize. It has nothing to do with me. How can it have nothing to do with you? Why don't you take a look at what you've done for the past 3 years? Look, during the time you were in charge of the Sword Garret, the Sword Garret was in a mess, and the number of new sword bearers in Yuzhang City has been decreasing year by year. This is all your fault and you should make up for it. Lu Shihua, if you still regard yourself as the Sword Pavilion Master of Yuzhang City, then show the responsibility of a Sword Pavilion Master and sacrifice a little bit of your insignificant dignity for the safety of Yuzhang City. What qualifications do you have to be the Sword Pavilion's Pavilion Master? Shi Jueyuan's words were like a sharp knife, digging into Lu Shihua's heart. You've finally revealed your true purpose. It turns out that you've said so much just to pull me down from the position of Sword Pavilion Master. Lu Shihua sneered and stood up. Now that things have come to this, I don't want to talk to you anymore. If you have the ability, then kill me and let your people take the position of Sword Pavilion Master. Otherwise, don't even think about making me give up my position. Don't forget the rules of the Sword Pavilion. Unless I, as the Sword Pavilion Master, take the initiative to give up my position to the Sword Committee, your people can forget about inheriting the position of Sword Pavilion Master. I can't be bothered to attend this meeting. There are still a lot of things to do in the Sword Pavilion. Forgive me for not accompanying you, Lu Shihua said as she walked directly to the door of the meeting room. She didn't want to pay any more attention to these disgusting people. Close the door. Let's see who has the ability to leave here, Shi Jueyuan shouted. The 2 sword-bearers standing guard at the door immediately closed the door of the meeting room, locking Lu Shihua in the meeting room. Shi Jueyuan, what are you doing? Don't forget that I'm the Sword Pavilion Master. Do you want to offend your superior? Lu Shihua was so angry that her face was distorted. She turned her head and shouted at Shi Jueyuan. Elder Shi, you've gone too far. Lu Shihua is still the Sword Pavilion Master. What right do you have to stand in her way? The Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit also stepped forward. It was a pity that apart from the Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit, no other spirit sword bearers stepped forward. Including the Xian Sword Spirit, all of these spirit sword bearers who had once been indebted to Lu Lei remained silent at this moment. It was as if they couldn't see this. You guys! Seeing the behavior of its former companions, the Sword Spirit Tiger's roar was so angry that its teeth were trembling. However, it was useless. The Sword Pavilion Master can't get over it right now. Let's help her get over it. Shi Jueyuan smiled. Then, he turned to Sword Immortal Ling Su and said, Chairman, please open the Void Gate now and send Pavilion Master Lu Shihua to the Yuyang Fortress. I've already prepared a convoy there to escort our Sword Pavilion to London City. I'm sure Pavilion Master Lu Shihua will understand on the way there. This. Hearing Shi Jueyuan's words, Sword Immortal Ling Su hesitated. To be honest, Shi Jueyuan's arrogant attitude made Sword Immortal Ling Su very unhappy. However, Shi Jueyuan controlled the local faction in Yuzhang City. If Sword Immortal Ling Su couldn't get Shi Jueyuan's help, he might not even be able to give orders outside the headquarters. Chairman, I think you can take over the position of Dean of Yuzhang University. This way, the younger generation of Yuzhang City can receive guidance from you. This way, we'll have a better and brighter future. Shi Jueyuan suddenly whispered in Sword Immortal Ling Su's ear. Sword Immortal Ling Su instantly understood. This was a deal. As long as he agreed to send Lu Shihua to London City, the local faction represented by Shi Juiyuan would be willing to hand over the management of Yuzhang University to him. An ordinary position was one thing, but Yuzhang University was indeed very important. This meant that the future swordsmen of Yuzhang City's younger generation would be his students. After 7 or 8 years, when these students had all grown up, he would be able to establish a foundation in Yuzhang City. This was very important for Sword Immortal Ling Su to integrate into Yuzhang City. And this was not something that Shi Juiyuan would lose out on. The dean of Yuzhang University was originally the Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit, the last nail that Lu Lei had left in Yuzhang City. As long as he united with Sword Immortal Ling Su's power to remove this nail, then the local faction in Yuzhang City would be completely under his command. He would also make a huge profit. I'm ashamed. Originally, it was my task to deal with this Yuan Ko. It's a pity that it's too powerful. I can only trouble Pavilion Master Lu Shihua to make a trip. Sword Immortal Ling Su nodded and reached out to open a void gate. I'm not leaving, don't even think about making me leave. Lu Shihua suddenly ran toward the window of the conference room, trying to escape through the window. He believed that as long as he left the conference room, these people would not dare to use force on him in public. However, Lu Shihua was only an ancient sword rank sword wielder, and everyone present was at least a famed sword rank sword wielder. Lu Shihua had barely taken a step when he was caught by Mu Shui's sword spirit. Then, Shi Juiyuan's hands flew up and down at the same time, performing a very complicated hand gesture. When this hand gesture was completed, a sealing talisman was placed on Lu Shihua's chest. All the sword essence in Lu Shihua's body was instantly sealed, and he became a normal person. The Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit wanted to stop this from happening, but it was firmly held back by the other spirit sword wielder around it. It could only watch as everything unfolded. Mu Shui Sword Spirit personally escort him to London City. Make sure not to let him escape on the way, Shi Juiyuan said to the Mu Shui Sword Spirit. The Mu Shui Sword Spirit nodded proudly and grabbed Lu Shihua into the void gate. Then, the void gate closed, and the conference room returned to silence. Only the Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit continued to shout, "You will regret this. If Gohan knew that you treated his disciple like this, he would definitely not let you go." Him? Shi Juiyuan revealed a disdainful smile. His Zifu has been sealed, and he is now just an ordinary person. I'm guessing that he must be hiding in a corner, shivering. Maybe he has already died in the hands of Yuan Ko. I actually hope that he will appear in front of me, so that I can send him and his disciple to see Long Shi Jiandi. Oh, that's right, I see that the Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit's mood is somewhat unstable. You must be very busy recently. It must be because you have been worrying too much about the matters of Yuzhang University that your sword essence hasn't improved much. I think it's better to go out and practice with those Yuan Ko, so that you won't rust in Yuzhang City. Our Yuzhang City is still waiting for the Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit to become an immortal sword-level sword bearer, Shi Juiyuan said with a face full of smiles. You despicable villain, you actually took advantage of Yuzhang City's crisis to do this kind of stupid thing. Sooner or later, Yuzhang City will be destroyed in the hands of a beast like you. Let me go, if you still love the brotherly affection of the past, then let me go. The Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit broke free from the 3 spirit sword-level sword bearers who were holding him down. Don't worry, I, the Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit, don't have the ability to teach this old guy a lesson. I also don't want to be the dean of Yuzhang University. But remember, there will be people who will come to find you for revenge. At that time, all of you will be accomplices. With that, the Roaring Tiger Sword Spirit strode out of the conference room with his head held high. From then on, he didn't step into Yuzhang City Sword Committee for a long time. Good move, Elder Shi. Seeing that Shi Jueyuan had easily gotten rid of his two biggest opponents in this crisis, Sword Immortal Ling Su couldn't help but clap his hands in admiration. Now that those who should go have gone, I wonder if Elder Shi can come up with a way to get rid of that flood-level Yuan Ko for our Yuzhang city? Shi Jiyuan was stunned for a moment. Didn't I say that as long as we hand Lu Shihua over to Long Shi will help us? Ai. It will take at least 10 days from Yeyang Fortress to London. By the time Lu Shihua arrives in London, I'm afraid that our Yuzhang city's dimensional protection wall will have been destroyed by this Yuan Ko. Sword Immortal Ling Su shook his head. So I hope that Elder Shi can think of a way to deal with the strategy just now. Even if we can't get rid of this Yuan Ko, we can at least delay it for 10 days until Long Shi takes action. This. Shi Jueyuan said awkwardly for a long time, but he still couldn't come up with a proper strategy. This old man can't do anything. This old man really can't think of any way. Chapter 1084. Shang Yi, who was slumped in his seat like a pile of mud, felt that the past 2 days were like a dream. It was as if he was flying in the air all the time. His whole body felt soft and light. At this time, Shang Yi did not want to complain. He just wanted to return to Yuzhang City alive. That was all. Fortunately, Gu Xianyuan's driving skills were much better than her brother Gu Han's driving skills. After 2 days of flying at high speed, there were no accidents at all. The entire journey was as smooth as if they were driving on a wide road. After Shang Yi did not know how long the Yan Huang 3008 had been driving for, the speed of the car began to slow down. Finally, it slowly came to a stop. What's wrong? Shang Yi raised his head curiously. Through the window, he saw the towering and wide city walls. Tears rolled down his eyes uncontrollably. Great, he finally saw the city walls of Yuzhang City. He, Shang Yi, had finally returned alive. When they left, there were more than a dozen people in the team. But when they returned, there were only 4 people left. Gu Xianyuan had joined them halfway. Of the companions who had set off with them, except for 2 who had gone missing, the rest were dead. Only Shang Yi, Chu Hanming, and Zhuozong were left alive. However, Shang Yi did not have much time to lament over what he had encountered during this period of time, because in the next second, a series of dragon roars rang through Shang Yi's head. The thunder dragon that he had met once was now hovering above Yuzhang City. Countless lightning bolts fell from the sky around her, and each lightning bolt was targeting Yuzhang City below her. However, before the lightning could reach the city, it was blocked by the dimensional wall that enveloped Yuzhang City. It stirred up ripples like water on the dimensional wall. It stopped. Accept inspection. Several sword-wielding guards at the gate of Yuzhang City said nervously. Anyone would feel nervous when lightning kept falling from above. Because of the appearance of this lightning dragon, the entire Yuzhang City had entered a state of high alert. Although the dimensional wall was still in place and Yuzhang City was temporarily safe, who knew if the other Yuan Ko would receive the news and launch another full-scale attack on Yuzhang City? Hi, it's me. I'm Shang Yi. Shang Yi, who was following behind Gu Xianyuan, seemed to recognize this guard, and immediately rushed up and said with some excitement, "Big brother Shang Yi, you're back. Didn't I hear that you went out to hunt for treasures?" Sure enough, the guard recognized Shang Yi. The 2 of them hugged each other excitedly. After a while, Shang Yi sighed and said, "Don't mention it. Let alone treasure hunting, I almost lost my life. If it weren't for Miss Xianyuan, I'm afraid we wouldn't be able to see each other in this lifetime. Come on, it's not a good thing to come back. Maybe the only thing that awaits us is death." The guard bitterly smiled. "Why is there only one lightning dragon? What about the other Yuan Ko?" Gu Xianyuan suddenly interrupted and asked. "Beauty, you have no idea. From the beginning to the end, there was only one Yuan Ko. None of the other Yuan Kos appeared. It's as strange as seeing a ghost." The guard replied. Then why did Lu Shihua tell me that Yuzhang City is in danger? The dimensional barrier will be broken in 2 or 3 days at most. Gohan felt even more strange. If there was only one Hong-level Yuan Ko, Yuzhang City would have no problem holding on for 3 years. How could it not hold on for 3 days? He had risked great danger to run in the jungle, and almost lost his life. Beauty, you have no idea. This time, it was a blind cat bumping into a dead mouse. Everything happened together. The core system of our Yuzhang City's dimensional barrier has a problem. As a result, it can't accept the sword element replenishment from our sword bearers. It can only consume the stored energy of the system. I heard that the current energy can only last for 2 or 3 hours at most before all the energy of the dimensional barrier is exhausted. Now, Yuzhang City's emergency system has been activated, and the ordinary people in Yuzhang City have all hidden underground. You guys came back just in time. Otherwise, in half an hour, all the guards would have to retreat to the core area. Be it ordinary people or sword bearers, no one will be left in the normal area. I can only hope that the medium-sized dimensional barrier in the core area can withstand the attack of this Yuan Ko. The guard sighed and said, I see. But why didn't Lu Shihua tell me about this? Gohan became even more confused as he solved one of his doubts. In fact, Lu Shihua was dragged to a meeting by the Sword Council before he could finish his call. Afraid that Gohan's whereabouts would be exposed if he answered the call, Lu Shihua could only hang up in a hurry and did not tell Gohan everything. At this time, the energy of the outermost super-dimensional barrier system was almost depleted by Kana Kamui. Therefore, Yuzhang City had all the ordinary people escape into the emergency system in advance. The remaining sword bearers could only rely on the other dimensional barrier system in the core area to resist. This dimensional barrier system was not damaged, so it could still withstand Kana Kamui's attack. However, the total energy of the dimensional barrier system in the core area was far less than the large dimensional barrier system outside. Also, there was a limit to the amount of sword element that could be replenished per second. Whether it could last long under the attack of the flood-class Yuan Ko, only God knew. And even if the core area could last long, the emergency system underground might not. Once the flood-class dragon launched an attack on the normal area, even if the ordinary people hid in the underground shelter system, there was no guarantee of absolute safety. Otherwise, Gohan's parents would not have died in the hands of the Transformer when they had clearly hidden in the underground shelter system. Whatever, I have to enter the core area as soon as possible, Gohan said anxiously. A flood-class Yuan Ko, even if Gohan, who had transformed into Gu Xianyuan, went all out and used all his strength without reservation, it was impossible to defeat a flood-class Yuan Ko. This had already exceeded the ability of a famous sword-level sword bearer. At this time, there was only one urgent matter for Gohan, and that was to become a spirit sword-level sword bearer as soon as possible. Only then could he completely exert his sword element to the extreme, so that he could drive away this flood-class Yuan Ko. Before becoming an immortal sword-level sword bearer, it was impossible for Gohan to have the strength to kill a flood-class Yuan Ko. Being able to find a way to drive it away was already Gohan's greatest limit. Therefore, Gohan couldn't wait to enter Yuzhang City and synchronize with the Spirit Sword-level Swordmistress in the core area to become a Spirit Sword-level sword bearer before the outer super-large dimensional wall was destroyed by this thunder and lightning dragon. Beauty, I know you don't want to stay here and take risks, but you still have to go through the basic procedures. Just swipe your personal terminal here and you can go in, the guard said. This was just a simple routine check. Any sword bearer entering the base city had to go through such a check. There was nothing special or strange about it. But this sentence hit Gohan's heart like a bolt from the blue. If Gohan swiped his personal terminal here at this time, his identity as Gohan would be exposed. If he was still a male Gohan at this time, then he would be exposed. Gohan was not afraid that Yuzhong City would dare to do anything to him. But the problem now was that Gohan was using a female body. It was impossible to borrow or replace a personal terminal. Each personal terminal was bound together through DNA authentication. Then, the news of Gohan's sex change into a woman would inevitably spread. At that time, even if Gohan's skin was as thick as a city wall, it would still be impossible for him to live in Yuzhong City. For a moment, Gohan unexpectedly fell into hesitation. "Brother, our personal terminals are all broken. I don't know if we can still pass the scan." On the other side, Shang Yi asked with some concern. He had never experienced a personal terminal being broken. "It's okay. Our scanning device is specially made to target the core chip of the personal terminal. Unless your core chip is also damaged, then you can only stay in the core area's isolation room for a while. After the laboratory carries out DNA authentication for you and reapplies for a new personal terminal, you can be released," the guard explained. "That's okay. Our personal terminal's external communication system is broken, but the other functions are still normal. The core chip should be fine," Shang Yi said with a sigh of relief. Then, he took the broken personal terminal and scanned it on the scanning device. As expected, it passed the scan. "Looks like I have to destroy the entire personal terminal first." This conversation was heard by Gohan. This was the only thing he could do now. He could only completely destroy his personal terminal and sneak into the core area under the name of reapplying for a personal terminal. When he reached the core area, he would wait for an opportunity to slip away. He believed that these people would not be able to stop him. But this way, Gohan would become a person with no identity. Not only would he be unable to use most of the social functions, he would not even be able to enter Jiang'a. But this was not important. The current Jiang'a master was his disciple Lu Shihua. As long as he said the word, he could move freely in Jiang'a. It was not a big deal whether he had a personal terminal or not. Thinking of Lu Shihua, Gohan's heart was filled with worry. Ever since he communicated with Lu Shihua that day, Gohan had sent out 3 communication invitations to Lu Shihua, but he did not get any response. It was as if Lu Shihua's personal terminal was also broken. He could only hope that she was too busy and did not have time to care about him. After figuring this out, Gu Xianyuan did not hesitate to press his finger on the personal terminal on his wrist. Then, his finger shot out a needle-like sword chi. The entire personal terminal instantly emitted a few wisps of white smoke, and then it was completely destroyed from the inside out. The core chip and whatnot were all burned. Chapter 1085. Just as Gohan completely destroyed the personal terminal on his wrist, the entire world suddenly began to tremble, as if the heavens and earth were collapsing. Gohan and the others immediately raised their heads subconsciously, looking at the giant white dragon in the sky. Countless scales on the wings of the giant white dragon shot out like machine gun bullets, and the dimensional barrier of Yuzhong City was instantly forced to withstand the impact of tens of thousands of scales. Every scale that hit the dimensional barrier released a mushroom cloud of smoke like a missile, creating continuous ripples on the dimensional barrier. If it was just one collision and explosion, it would have been fine, but when tens of thousands of explosions and collisions occurred on the dimensional barrier at the same time, the remaining energy of the entire dimensional barrier poured out like an avalanche. Not good. If this goes on, the dimensional barrier won't last for more than a few minutes. We have to get out of here. Gu Xuanyuan's expression suddenly changed. She no longer cared about the inspection and directly jumped into the driver's seat of the Yan Huang 3008 beside her. She shouted at Shang Yi, Chu Hanming, and the few guards, "Hurry up and get in the car, or all of you will die here. No, you haven't passed the inspection, this is not in line with the procedures." Before the guard could finish his sentence, he was dragged into the Yan Huang 3008 by Shang Yi, who was beside him. "My big brother, let's not bother about the inspection now." The Yen Huang 3008 was originally designed for 4 people, and now with the addition of 2 guards, it suddenly became a little crowded. However, Gu Xinyuan couldn't care less. She stepped hard on the accelerator with her right foot, and the Yen Huang 3008 broke through the guard's sentry post, roaring towards the core area of Yuzhong City. "Oh my god! That's so fast! Pretty lady, you're speeding. You're breaking the traffic rules." The guard was so frightened by the speed of the Yen Huang 3008 that he screamed. At the same time, he didn't forget to tell Gu Xianyuan that she was speeding. Just as the guard was screaming, Yuzhong City's dimensional barrier system finally could not withstand such a crazy bombardment. Countless cracks spread across the dimensional barrier, and finally, the entire dimensional barrier system made a crisp shattering sound, and then completely turned into nothingness. The entire Yuzhong City had become a defenseless city. The moment Yuzhong City's dimensional barrier broke, countless pairs of eyes hiding in the dark around Yuzhong City bloomed with shock and confusion. These were all spies sent by some of the major forces of Yuan Ko. They had already heard that a flood-level Yuan Ko was launching an attack on Yuzhong City's dimensional barrier, but these Yuan Ko forces, who had been tortured by the dimensional barrier system, knew that a flood-level Yuan Ko's strength could not do anything to the super-dimensional barrier system of the base city. The energy consumption of this flood-level Yuan Ko was not as fast as the super-dimensional barrier system could recover. Therefore, although these major forces wanted to break through Yuzhong City's defense, they still suppressed their thoughts. After all, every major attack on a base city had to be planned carefully, and at the same time, they had to mobilize as many Yuan Ko forces as possible to launch an attack. If they rashly cooperated with this flood-level Yuan Ko, not only would they not be of any help, but they would also sacrifice their own subordinates in vain. Therefore, these Yuan Ko forces didn't pay much attention to the Thunder Dragon's attack, nor did they dispatch their own forces to coordinate with the Thunder Dragon's attack. In their opinion, this attack would be futile, and it would be impossible for them to gain anything. However, these major forces still placed their spies around Yuzhong City, always paying attention to the development of the battle. As a result, at this moment, all the major forces of Yuan Ko were stunned. They did not expect that this flood-level Yuan Ko would actually break through Yuzhong City's dimensional barrier system. The entire city was exposed to all of Yuan Ko without any protection. Are the sword-bearers in Yuzhong City crazy? Why don't they replenish the energy of the dimensional barrier system? The leaders of these major forces of Yuan Ko complained at the same time. For the first time, they began to hate the sword-bearers of Yuzhong City for not defending with all their might. However, while complaining, these major forces also began to frantically mobilize their subordinates' forces. This was a great opportunity. Once Yuzhong City's dimensional defense system was breached, it would take at least 24 hours for it to be reactivated. This was the best chance for the Yuan bandits to attack Yuzhong City. In Yuzhong City, the situation of Gohan and the others became even more difficult. Previously, with the protection of the dimensional barrier, although the lightning dragon's scales were powerful, they were all blocked and did not harm Gohan and the others' hovercraft. However, when the dimensional barrier was broken, these scales smashed into various buildings in Yuzhong City like missiles, and the entire city became a sea of fire in an instant. While the Yen Huang 3008 controlled by Gohan continued to advance toward the core area, it also had to avoid the scales falling from the sky. Once hit directly by these scales, Gohan might be fine, but the sword-bearers of Yen Huang 3008 were bound to be in danger. Damn it! If only the quantum teleportation formation system had not been shut down. Otherwise, we would have directly returned to the core area. Shang Yi gritted his teeth as he saw the scales falling from the sky. Because of the previous attack on the quantum teleportation formation system, Yuzhong City had very simply removed all the quantum teleportation formations. This stupid, one-size-fits-all approach had directly led to the current consequences. The sword-bearers who were still in the normal area had to return to the core area of Yuzhang City via hovercraft. Many sword-bearers were hit by the scales on the way back and sent into the sky by the huge explosion. With the power of these scales' explosion, unless it was an ancient sword-level sword-bearer with more than 10,000 sword elements, with the strength of the protective shield of an ancient sword-level sword-bearer, it would be instantly consumed by the explosion of these scales, and eventually become a bloody corpse. This beast. Shang Yi looked at the white dragon in the sky and cursed angrily. There's no need to scold her. Gu Xianyuan did not even look at the dragon. She quickly dodged the scales falling from the sky from all angles as she said calmly, "This is a matter of course for her, and for us, killing her is also a matter of course." After saying this, the scale bombs in the sky instantly stopped. It seemed like such a skill was also very energy-consuming for the lightning dragon. After breaking through Yuzhang City's dimensional barrier system, the dragon took the initiative to stop such attack. Without the damage of these scale bombs, the Yan Huang 3008 could also move at a faster speed towards the core area. Strange, what is this Yuan Ko trying to do? Shang Yi saw through the open skylight of the Yan Huang 3008 that after the lightning dragon destroyed Yuzhang City's dimensional barrier system, it did not wildly destroy the city like most of the Yuan Ko. At the same time, it thought of ways to kill the humans hiding in the underground shelters. After breaking through the dimensional barrier system, the lightning dragon seemed to have lost its target. It floated sluggishly in the air and did not do anything. "I'm afraid she's looking for food," Gu Xianyuan thought as she drove. "Have you guys forgotten what happened after she was freed from the seal?" Only then did Shang Yi remember that the first thing the lightning dragon did after being freed from the seal was to look for food. It even swallowed Li Xiangtian into its mouth, but when it realized that it did not taste good, it spat Li Xiangtian out. But what does this dragon want to eat? Doesn't she not like to eat humans? Shang Yi asked curiously. There must be something that only Yuzhang City has attracted this dragon. Gu Xianyuan sighed. Look, that dragon is moving again. This time, even Gu Xianyuan couldn't help but raise his head to observe the movements of the lightning dragon. In the end, he discovered that the lightning dragon no longer cared about the normal area. Instead, it flew above the core area, and with a dive, it was ready to pounce into the core area. In the end, the lightning dragon was naturally blocked by the dimensional barrier system in the core area. Why is there one here too? How annoying! After the lightning dragon let out a hungry dragon's roar in the voice of a Lolita, lightning once again fell from the sky and began to wear down the core area's dimensional barrier system. Looks like the thing this dragon is looking for is in the core area. Gu Xianyuan drove the Yan Huang 3008 directly to the core area's gate with a drift. This gate was very familiar to Gohan. This was the gate that Gohan had walked through when he led 1,000 sword-bearers back to the core area to fight. However, at that time, Gohan had 1,000 menacing sword-bearers behind him. Now, Gohan only had a hovercraft, and he could not appear with his real identity. He could only appear here as Gu Xianyuan. All of you, get out of the car quickly. No crowding. All sword-bearers, immediately approach the nearest sword essence absorption system and input sword essence into the dimensional barrier system. At the gate of the core area, dozens of sword-bearers and their sword mistresses stood guard, guiding the sword-bearers and ordinary people who were escaping into the core area from all directions. I'll return the car to you. Keep it properly. Chu Hanming suddenly felt a key placed in his palm, and then Gu Xianyuan was like a beautiful fairy, passing through the crowd in no time, and entered the depths of the core area. It was as if the surging crowd that he couldn't intervene in did not exist at all. So beautiful! Looking at Gu Xuanyuan's back, Chu Hanming said in a daze, I've decided, I must take her as my wife. Chu Hanming secretly made up his mind. Even if he had to give up everything, he would marry Gu Xianyuan and become an enviable immortal couple. Chapter 1086. Although it was necessary to verify one's identity through a personal terminal when entering the core area, thanks to the chaotic flow of people, the so-called sword bearers could not even keep up with the flow of people in the dojo, so the verification of the sword bearer's identity was completely suspended. In the minds of these guards, it was impossible for Yuan Ko to pass through the dimensional wall system, so the identity verification was just superfluous. After entering the core area, Gohan saw people constantly directing the crowd, and at the same time, letting the sword bearers head to the wall of the core area to provide sword essence to the core area's dimensional wall system, helping the core area's dimensional wall system resist the dragon's attack. However, Gohan was very clear that the core area's dimensional wall system was far inferior to the super-dimensional wall system, and there was also a limit to the flow of sword essence. The core area's dimensional wall system's replenishment rate of sword essence could not keep up with the rate of energy consumption. In less than 4 or 5 days, the core area's dimensional wall system would completely collapse, just like the super-dimensional wall system outside. More importantly, when the super-dimensional wall system of Yuzhong City collapsed, it was impossible for those big forces of Yuan Ko who had been lurking in the dark to not notice it. They would definitely flock to Yuzhong City from all directions, and in less than half a day, the Yuan Ko army would arrive. The core area's dimensional wall system's energy consumption rate would also greatly increase. By that time, let alone 4 or 5 days, it might not even be able to last half a day. Lu Shihua. Gohan instinctively wanted to contact Lu Shihua through his personal terminal, but when his fingers touched his wrist, he found that his personal terminal had been destroyed in his hand. Gohan could no longer get in touch with others. Forget it, it's the same if I go to the sword pavilion alone. Gu Xianyuan gave up the idea of contacting Lu Shihua and walked in the direction of the sword pavilion alone. When Gohan once again came to the sword pavilion that he had not seen for 3 years, Gohan felt very emotional. He did not know how Lu Shihua was managing the sword pavilion. It must be very hard for her to run it alone. However, when Gohan arrived at the entrance of the sword pavilion, he suddenly discovered that the door was tightly shut. This caused Gohan's expression to change abruptly. Although Yuzhong City was in danger, according to the rules, unless the core of Yuzhong City had been invaded by Yuan Ko, the gate of the sword garret was not allowed to be closed. But at this moment, the gate of the sword pavilion was closed and locked by an electronic lock. Did something bad happen to the sword pavilion? Who are you? What are you doing at the entrance of the sword pavilion? Just as Gohan was feeling puzzled, a questioning voice came from behind Gohan. Gohan turned his head to take a look. It was an acquaintance of Gohan's. It was the practical training teacher who had once sent Gohan to the hospital during the practical training course at Yuzhong University. It was Li Xian. When Gu Xianyuan turned her head and revealed her true appearance, Li Xian was shocked. He didn't expect such a beautiful woman to exist in this world. This woman was more beautiful than any woman he had ever seen. Perhaps only the legendary 4 most beautiful sword maidens could compete with this woman in terms of beauty. While Li Xian was immersed in Gu Xuanyuan's beauty, Gohan also noticed that there were still only 2 scabbards hanging on Li Xian's waist. Almost 4 years had passed, but Li Xian was still a sword wielder of the sword pavilion. He had not improved at all. So it's teacher Li Xian. When he saw Li Xian, Gohan hesitated for a moment before addressing him as teacher. Who said that this teacher had almost killed him? But he was still his teacher in the past. There was a world of difference between Gohan's current strength and that of 3 years ago. The Gohan of 3 years ago might have made things difficult for Li Xian when he saw him again. However, the current Gohan had already gotten over it. He could not be bothered to deal with Li Xian and Lu Chan anymore. Moreover, the current Gohan was not Gohan, but Gu Xianyuan. You know me? And you call me teacher? Li Xian was shocked. Why don't I remember? Do I have such a beautiful student like you? I didn't expect Teacher Li Xian to still be so lecherous after not seeing him for 7 or 8 years. Gu Xianyuan said bluntly. I didn't expect you to remember all this. Li Xian smiled awkwardly. You definitely won't be able to guess what I went through after that. Actually, I'm no longer a teacher now. I was chased out of Yuzhang University 3 years ago. Now I'm a warrior. It's easier and more comfortable for me to fight and kill outside. Oh, Gu Xianyuan replied. That. Speaking of which, aren't you curious why I was chased out of Yuzhang University? Li Xian felt a little uncomfortable when he saw how calm Gu Xianyuan was. According to Li Xian's original plan, this beautiful girl, who was his former student, would definitely ask him about the reason why he was chased out of Yuzhang University after he told her about his tragic experience. Then, he would be able to talk a lot with this beautiful girl and tell her about his tragic experience. It might even inspire his former student to feel pity for him, which would then lead to a deeper relationship. However, Gu Xianyuan was so calm, as if she was not curious about why he had been chased out of Yuzhang University. This made Li Xian feel very pained. It was like having a fishbone stuck in his throat. Li Xian felt uncomfortable if he did not spit it out. I think I should tell you about it. It happened 3 years ago. I taught a class, but an accident happened in that class. A sword-wielding student with no abilities at all almost died in the hands of a tiger-rank Yuan Ko. I was scolded by the dean. I couldn't take it anymore, so I took the initiative to resign. Li Xian sighed and said with a sorrowful look. Then, he looked at the beautiful student, Gu Xianyuan, with a face full of anticipation, hoping that she could comfort him. Is the student that Teacher Li Xian mentioned called Guhan? Guhan could not be bothered to deal with this lecherous guy anymore, so he asked straightforwardly. How did you know? Li Xian was so scared that his eyeballs were about to fall out of their sockets. Only a few people in Yuzhang City knew about this. Guhan is my biological brother. Teacher Li Xian, how do you think I know? Gu Xianyuan said coldly. It's over. I actually bumped into Guhan's biological sister. Li Xian's entire body immediately shrank. It was only then that Li Xian noticed that there were 3 scabbards hanging on Gu Xuanyuan's waist. He was surprised to find out that she was actually a famed sword-rank sword-wielder. The lecherous thoughts in his heart were instantly extinguished. What a joke! Guhan, that pervert, had already become a famed sword-rank sword-wielder 3 years ago. His sister must also be a pervert. He could not fall into the hands of the Gu family again. Therefore, Li Xian smiled awkwardly and prepared to sneak out of the place. Wait. Unexpectedly, Gu Xianyuan called out to Li Xian. Teacher Li Xian, what happened back then is in the past. Guhan said that he doesn't blame you for a long time. Let's just pretend that it never happened. The 2 of us will definitely not take revenge on you because of that. Is that so? Li Xian immediately heaved a sigh of relief when he heard Gu Xuanyuan's words. However, Teacher Li Xian, I have something to ask you. Why is the Sword Tower's main door locked now? The dimensional barrier in the core area is clearly still there. Gu Xianyuan finally found an acquaintance and asked directly. Your younger brother was the previous Sword Tower master? How could you not know what happened in the Sword Tower? Li Xian asked with a puzzled look. I've always been fighting in Yanjing City, and I rarely cared about my younger brother's matters. My younger brother never told me about his matters either. It was only when my younger brother went missing that I had no choice but to return to Yuzhang City to deal with some matters. So what's wrong with the Sword Tower? Where is the Sword Tower master here, my younger brother's disciple, Lu Shihua? Gu Xianyuan asked continuously. Sai, speaking of the current Sword Tower master, your younger brother's disciple is really pitiful. He clearly doesn't have much strength, but your younger brother forcefully placed him in the position of Sword Tower Master. I really don't know what your younger brother is thinking. Li Xian sighed and then continued, Beautiful lady, don't blame me, Li Xian. To be honest, your younger brother has really done a terrible job in this matter. You don't know what kind of life Lu Shihua has been living for the past 3 years. What kind of life has she been living? Upon hearing Li Xian's words, Gohan's heart felt as if it had been firmly grasped by a hand and instantly twisted into a fried dough twist. The decision he had made 3 years ago had been too rash and impulsive. Gohan knew this very well. In the beginning, there were all sorts of curses and rumors. They all said that Lu Shihua had used her beauty to seduce your younger brother, causing him to pass the position of Sword Tower Master to her. This caused Lu Shihua to become synonymous with the word slut in Yuzhang City. Beautiful lady, you are also a woman. You should know how great the damage such rumors caused to Lu Shihua. I heard that during that period of time, Lu Shihua was scolded so badly by the rumors that she wanted to commit suicide by cutting her wrists several times. Later, I don't know who gave Lu Shihua the idea to take the initiative to go to the hospital for a checkup. At the same time, she had the highest level of artificial intelligence supervise the entire process. The highest level of artificial intelligence proved that she was still a virgin. Only then did the rumors gradually die down. But that was just the beginning. More terrible things happened to your younger brother's disciple, Li Xian said with a sad expression. Chapter 1087. After Lu Shihua proved his innocence, there was a huge wave of resignations in the sword pavilion. Li Xian sighed and said, those sword wielders who originally worked in the sword pavilion said that they did not want to be led by an ancient sword rank sword wielder, so they all resigned and left the sword pavilion. In the end, there were less than 1/10 of the original sword bearers left in the sword pavilion. And it was said that the 10th of the sword bearers had a bad work attitude. They turned a deaf ear to the sword pavilion master's orders and spent their days in the sword pavilion. In the end, all the work in the sword pavilion fell to Lu Shihua alone. She was busy in and out of the sword pavilion every day. I heard that she had not left the sword pavilion for more than a year. Later, Lu Shihua recruited many ordinary people into the sword pavilion and then took the initiative to dismiss all the sword bearers in the sword pavilion. Only then did the work in the sword pavilion return to normal. However, the sword committee immediately told Lu Shihua that the conflict between the sword bearers and ordinary people in Yuzhang City was more intense. They hoped that there would be a sword bearer with status to preside over the conflict between the ordinary people and the sword bearers. Who else but your brother's disciple, Lu Shihua, could be appointed as the chairman of the Yuzhang City Mediation Committee? Lu Shihua was appointed as the chairman of the Yuzhang City Mediation Committee, responsible for mediating the various conflicts between the ordinary people and the sword bearers. Beauty, you know that the most painful thing in the world is to mediate disputes between people. Back then, your brother almost got locked up in prison for killing an ordinary person. It took him dozens of days to calm down. However, Lu Shihua has to deal with more than 10 such disputes every day. I heard that in the first month of her appointment, she lost more than 10 kilograms. Half of her hair turned white. She only sleeps for 3 to 4 hours a day. She looks like she has aged more than 10 years. She's so pitiful. Sigh. Following that, Li Xian told Gu Xianyuan a lot about how pitiful Lu Shihua was. Gu Xianyuan could not help but clench her fists as she listened. There were many reasons why Lu Shihua was so pitiful. One of them was because of his cold body, and the other was because of the Sword Association. Could it be that this group of bastards wanted to cripple a future sword emperor? Let me ask you, do you know which ancient sword rank sword mistress Lu Shihua has? Gu Xianyuan could not help but ask this question. If the people of Yuzhang City knew that Lu Shihua's sword lady was the double-winged angel sword and that he would definitely become an emperor sword wielder in the future, would the people of Yuzhang City still dare to treat Lu Shihua like this? Would those people from the Sword Council continue to torture Lu Shihua like this? I know, it's the two-winged angel sword, right? To Gohan's surprise, Li Xian actually knew that Lu Shihua's sword mistress was the double-winged angel sword. In other words, everyone in Yuzhang City knew that Lu Shihua was a future emperor sword wielder. Why did everyone still treat Lu Shihua this way? Speaking of which, it's such a pity. Sigh. Our Yuzhang City could have had an emperor sword wielder, but who would have thought that we'd lose the four-winged angel sword? At this point, Li Xian's face trembled in pain. It was obvious that he was pained that Yuzhang City had lost an emperor sword rank. What's going on? How could he have lost the four-winged angel sword? Wasn't it kept in Yanjing City's sword tower? How could he have lost it? Gu Xianyuan asked agitatedly. Beauty, you're from Yanjing City. You don't even know this? Li Xian revealed a surprised expression. 3 years ago, when Sword Immortal Cloud Sky passed away, something big happened in Yanjing City. Sword Immortal Tianzi suddenly brought the sword mistress from Yanjing City's sword tower and rebelled. However, they were stopped by Hao Tianjiendi on the way. Hao Tianjiendi also snatched the dimensional pocket that Sword Immortal Tianzi had on him. Then, he used his emperor blood to open the sword purification pool and forcefully opened Sword Immortal Tianzi's dimensional pocket. He took back the sword mistress that Sword Immortal Tianzi had taken away. However, he didn't expect that there would only be about 90% of the sword mistresses in the dimensional pocket. About 10% of the natural sword mistresses were taken away by Sword Immortal Tianzi. The entire Yanjing City went crazy with anger, and the four-winged angel sword was among the sword mistresses that were lost. Sigh. If Pavilion Master Lucihua doesn't have the four-winged seraphim sword, it's impossible for him to become a saber-class sword wielder. Even if he still has the 6-winged, 8-winged, 10-winged, and 12-winged seraphim swords, it's useless. Without the 4-winged seraphim sword, Pavilion Master Lucihua is destined to be an ancient sword wielder for the rest of his life. Therefore, even though Pavilion Master Lu Shihua had already revealed her 2-winged angel sword when Sword Immortal Cloud Sky passed away and shocked the other sword bearers, the Sword Council also spent a lot of time trying to please her. However, once they realized that the 4-winged angel sword was gone, Pavilion Master Lu Shihua's situation completely fell to the bottom. He was like an angel that had been banished to the mortal world. In just a few words, Li Xian revealed a piece of shocking news that Guhan had never heard before. No wonder the Sword Council dared to treat Lu Shihua like this. It turned out that in their eyes, Lu Shihua had lost his value as half a Jiendi. Instead, he was a sword wielder who was destined to be an ancient sword wielder for the rest of his life. Why didn't I know about such an important matter? Gu Xianyuan was completely dumbfounded when she heard the news. How was it possible that she did not know about such an important piece of news? It's not surprising that you didn't know, beautiful. There are still some sword wielder who don't know about this. Li Xian quickly explained when he heard Gu Xianyuan mumbling to herself. It's fine that Yanjing City has been humiliated, but what's more terrifying is that they've lost 1/10 of their natural sword ladies. They don't dare to announce this important news to ordinary people. Otherwise, the entire Yanjing City will be in an uproar. Therefore, the Sword Council has ordered that this matter is strictly prohibited from spreading among ordinary people. At the same time, it's strictly prohibited from spreading on the internet. There's not even a bit of news about this matter on the internet. It's only been told to the higher-ups of the sword wielder in the various base cities. Although it's not prohibited among sword wielder, the Sword Council has also stipulated that unless the other party takes the initiative to ask, they are absolutely not allowed to mention this matter. At the same time, they have to inform ordinary people. Otherwise, they will all be locked up and suffer grievances. Now, 3 years have passed. Although some of the sword wielder have found out about this news through various channels, and the ban itself is gradually loosening and is no longer as strict as before, about half of the sword wielders still don't know about this important piece of news. especially those sword-wielder who have been fighting outside for the past 3 years. It's impossible for them to know about this news. It seems like you've been fighting to the death with Yuan Ko for the past 3 years, beautiful. Otherwise, it's impossible for you not to know about such important news. I've indeed been fighting outside for the past 3 years. Gu Xianyuan sighed. Based on the timeline, this incident happened when she was in Shanhaiguan. Shanhaiguan could only communicate with the outside world through the internet. Therefore, once this matter was banned from spreading on the internet, it was impossible for Guhan to find out about it through public channels. He could only wait for his friends to take the initiative to tell him. However, at that time, he happened to be cultivating in seclusion in the game. He took the initiative to block all communication with the outside world for about a year. Therefore, even if someone wanted to tell him about this news during this period, he wouldn't be able to receive it. When he ended his seclusion, this matter gradually became old news. No one thought of telling him anymore. In the end, he forcibly kept it a secret for 3 years. But what about Lu Shihua? He and Lu Shihua had been in contact for the past 3 years. Why didn't she tell him about such an important matter? Didn't she know to complain to her master? In fact, Guhan knew very well that Lu Shihua must have been worried that telling him about this would distract him in the dangerous Shanhaiguan. Therefore, she would rather bear all of this alone than tell him the truth. While Guhan was greatly moved by this, he also hated himself even more for putting Lu Shihua in the position of sword pavilion master, which was not suitable for her in the first place. Why did Sword Immortal Tian Hong betray humanity? He, an immortal sword-tier swordsman, betrayed humanity for no reason. Wait, you're saying that the swordsman who betrayed humanity is Sword Immortal Tian Hong? At this moment Guhan suddenly remembered. Wasn't Sword Immortal Tian Hong the immortal sword-tier swordsman who died in the hands of Medusa? Guhan had seen his corpse before, and it was clear that he could not be any more dead. How could he possibly betray humanity? There's something wrong here. There must be a big problem here. Guhan muttered to himself, but for a moment, Guhan couldn't figure out what the problem was. Although the news of Sword Immortal Tian Hong's death had been hidden from the ordinary people and some of the swordsmen, it was not a secret among the swordsmen in Yanjing City. A large number of swordsmen already knew about Sword Immortal Tian Hong's death before Guhan entered Shanhaiguan. In that case, wouldn't these swordsmen find it strange when they heard that Sword Immortal Tian Hong had betrayed humanity? Wouldn't they be curious about why a dead person could betray humanity? It seemed that even if this traitor wasn't Sword Immortal Tian Hong, he must be closely related to Sword Immortal Tian Hong. Could it be that Sword Immortal Tian Hong didn't really die back then, and was only faking his death? Thinking about it that way, it wasn't impossible. After all, the process of Sword Immortal Tian Hong's death was a little too ridiculous. No matter how one looked at it, it didn't seem like a way for a mortal sword-tier swordsman to die. Looks like I have to look for Ku Rak-in, Guhan thought to himself. Ku Rak-in had already left Shanhaiguan a year and a half ago. Given his entanglement with Sword Immortal Tian Hong, he would definitely find out the truth about Sword Immortal Tian Hong. Therefore, he would definitely be able to find out something from Ku Rak-in. And Guhan's ultimate goal was to find the stolen sword maidens, find the four-winged angel sword, and help his disciple regain his dazzling life. Alright, let's not talk about the past. Let's go back to the original question. Why is the sword tower's door locked? Where is Lu Shihua now? Chapter 1088. I really don't know. In the end, Teacher Li Xian had said so much, but he was unable to provide an answer to the first question. Yesterday morning, the entrance to the sword tower was locked. Pavilion Master Lu Shihua was nowhere to be seen. Besides, I'm not a member of the sword tower, so how could I know what happened there? Forget it. Take care, Teacher Li Xian. Gu Xianyuan waved her hand and walked towards the gate of the sword tower. Although Li Xian really wanted to get closer to this beauty, he immediately gave up on the thought that she was Gohan's sister and fled the place quickly. Looking at the tightly locked gate of the sword tower, Gohan fell into deep thought. As the previous pavilion master, Gohan naturally knew the sword tower very well. Although the sword tower was a huge and majestic building, there were no windows in the entire sword tower except for the pavilion master's office on the top floor. The gate of the sword tower was locked by a door lock made of emperor alloy. Unless one had the authorization of the pavilion master, it was impossible to unlock the door lock. As a result, entering the sword tower became a problem. It wasn't that Gohan couldn't force his way in, or he could just break a hole in the sword tower's wall. This was a rather amusing aspect of the sword pavilion. The lock of the sword pavilion's door was the strongest thing in the sword pavilion. The rest of the sword pavilion was made of dimensional alloy. An expert could easily break through the walls of the sword pavilion. If this was the sword tower of Beijing City, Gohan wouldn't even think about it and would just break the wall. However, this was the sword tower of Yuzhong City, which was considered Gohan's territory. How could Gohan bear to destroy his own things? As a result, Gohan was stuck outside the sword tower's gate, unable to advance or retreat. Either Gohan forcefully broke the sword tower's wall, or Gohan couldn't even think about entering the sword tower. Just when Gohan was feeling extremely distressed, Tian suddenly said to Gohan, "Go to the northwest corner of the sword pavilion, there's a wall there with the word Tian written on it. Find the Son of Heaven and press down hard on it, then you'll be able to enter the sword pavilion." "You're saying there's another secret door in the sword pavilion?" Hearing Tian's words, Gohan was very surprised, but he still followed Tian's instructions. Sure enough, in the northwest corner of the room, he found a small, beetle-sized heaven character. Pressing down on the character, the wall in front of Gohan opened up, revealing a secret door that led to the interior of Sword Pavilion. Why does the Sword Pavilion have such a secret door? Why don't I, the Sword Pavilion Master, know about it? Gohan was very surprised to enter the Sword Pavilion through this secret door. After becoming the Sword Pavilion Master, Gohan read all the confidential information that only the Sword Pavilion Master had access to. However, none of those confidential information mentioned this secret door. This was left behind by Zetian when he was building the Sword Pavilion. I didn't expect that after so many years, this secret door is still here. Tian lightly explained. Only now did Gohan remember that Tian and Zetian Jiendi had experienced the process of Yuzhong City from nothing to what it was. It can be said that Tian had watched the entire Yuzhong City being built. It seems that Zetian Jiendi had also left behind many secrets in the Sword Pavilion. For the time being, Gohan didn't think about Zetian Jiendi's matter. Instead, he strolled alone in the huge Sword Pavilion. The entire Sword Pavilion was empty, not even the beautiful waitresses were there. Only the lonely sword ladies were placed on their respective stands for Gohan to admire and admire. Gohan had been to the Sword Pavilion many times. However, he had never been in a situation where he was the only one in the Sword Pavilion. This gave him a completely different feeling. It was a pity that time did not allow Gohan to slowly enjoy the strange atmosphere. Gohan quickly walked up to the 4th floor of the Sword Pavilion. The 4th floor was where the Spirit Sword ladies were placed. It was also Gohan's goal this time. Gohan wanted to find a Spirit Sword lady to synchronize with him. When Gohan stepped on the 4th floor, a familiar impulse instantly filled Gohan's body. All the sword ladies on the 4th floor seemed to want Gohan to immediately pounce on them and synchronize with them. I didn't expect the sword affinity to be so strong after reaching the Spirit Sword rank. Am I really that popular? Feeling the familiar impulse of the sword affinity, Gohan couldn't help but say with some smugness, "I don't know if everyone still remembers this sword affinity. Any sword lady who takes the initiative to have a sword affinity with the sword holder has a much higher chance of synchronizing with them than under normal circumstances. The stronger the affinity, the higher the success rate. And now, almost all the spirit sword grade sword maidens on the 4th floor had a strong sword affinity with Guhan, which meant that Guhan could choose any spirit sword grade sword maiden on the 4th floor to synchronize with him. The importance of a spirit sword grade sword mother was self-evident. Guhan, of course, had to choose the most suitable sword mother for himself. Unfortunately, the spirit sword lady that Guhan thought was most suitable for him was not in the sword pavilion in Yuzhong City, but in Moscow base city. Originally, according to Guhan's plan, he would not become a spirit sword bearer for the time being. Instead, he had to go to Moscow to synchronize with the spirit sword lady. Unfortunately, now that Yuzhong City was facing a huge crisis, Guhan had to give up his perseverance and sacrifice a part of his future for Yuzhong City to find a spirit sword lady that was most suitable for him in Yuzhong City. There were not many natural spirit sword ladies in Yuzhong City, only about 10. After Guhan's selection, Guhan found that there were actually 2 spirit sword ladies that were most suitable for him. One was called God-Beating Sword, which was said to have been transformed from the divine weapon God-Beating Whip. It had infinite power and was the highest-ranking sword lady among all the spirit sword ladies in Yuzhong City. However, Guhan felt that this sword lady was actually not very suitable for him, because the characteristics of this God-Beating Sword were very strange. God-Beating Sword was a killing path sword lady, and its killing path characteristics were like this. God-Beating Sword. All damage to Taoist and Buddhist-related Yuan Ko increases by 1000%, all damage to non-Taoist and Buddhist-related Yuan Ko decreases by 1000%. This spirit sword lady was obviously specially used to deal with the Heavenly Court and Mount Lingshan and other forces Yuan Ko. When dealing with these Yuan Ko, the God-Beating Sword's effect could be said to be very obvious. It could be said to be an invincible divine weapon against these Yuan Ko. Its effect was even not weaker than the immortal sword lady. However, the problem was that the Heavenly Court and Mount Lingshan's Yuan Ko were only a small part of all the Yuan Ko, so when the God-Beating Sword faced the majority of Yuan Ko, its attack power would be reduced by 1000%. Then in Guhan's hands, what was the difference between this spirit sword lady and a famous sword lady? It could even be said that it was not as useful as a famous sword lady. At the very least, when facing the lightning dragon, the God-Beating Sword's effect was not as useful as Juzi's. Therefore, very quickly, Guhan gave up the idea of using the God-Beating Sword and turned to another spirit sword lady that was suitable for him, Demon Blade Muramasa. From this name, it could be seen that this was another Fusang lineage's sword lady, and it was also the most famous sword lady in the Fusang lineage other than the Heavenly Cumulus Sword. It was said that this spirit sword grade sword lady was known as the Demon Blade before the Great Apocalypse. That was because all the masters who wielded this demon blade had all died under its blade. It could be said to be a master killing sword. After the apocalypse, the demon blade Muramasa reappeared, and its killing path characteristics once again proved that it was indeed a spirit sword lady that killed its master. Killing its master. Intercourse with the Muramasa's sword lady, allowing the Muramasa to absorb the sword bearer's blood and essence through its lower body, permanently strengthening the demon blade Muramasa's attack power by 10% to 1,500%. Depending on the sword bearer's blood consumed, the demon blade Muramasa's attack power will be strengthened differently. The power of this characteristic was vividly demonstrated by the word permanent. Among all the sword ladies, there was no other sword lady that could be strengthened permanently. Moreover, it was a sword lady that could permanently strengthen the attack power by 1,500%. As long as the sword bearer consumed their own blood and essence, they could increase their strength by up to 15 times. An increase in attack power by 1,500% was not as simple as a simple increase in strength by 15 times. Such an increase in attack power could even allow a spirit sword bearer to reach the attack power of an immortal sword bearer. Such a terrifying increase would inevitably come at a heavy price, and this heavy price was that the consumed blood and essence could not be recovered through medical equipment, or even through the body itself. The Muramesa's sword bearer would not be able to recover this blood in their lifetime. According to calculations, to achieve the highest permanent strengthening of 1,500%, the sword bearer would need to consume 70% of the total amount of blood in their body. This was equivalent to reducing the upper limit of HP in the game, but the problem was that in the game, as long as you had 1 drop of HP left, you would still be alive. But in reality, if you only had 30% HP left, you would already be dead. In history, there was such a fool who tried to strengthen to 1,500%, but the fool died of severe anemia on the day of the strengthening. Some spirit sword bearers directly announced that they were suffering from severe anemia after the strengthening was completed. The bodies of these sword bearers instantly became extremely weak. Often, these sword bearers would die young in 2 or 3 years. Therefore, the strength of the Muramesa was completely exchanged with the sword bearer's own life. At the same time, it was a pain in the ass that after giving their blood and essence to the Muramesa, this sword bearer would forever lose the ability to reproduce. If they did not give birth to their own children before synchronizing with the Muramesa, then this sword bearer would definitely die. In fact, even if the Muramesa did not absorb the sword bearer's blood, his own attack power was among the best among all the sword ladies of the spirit sword realm. Therefore, there was no need for these sword bearers of the spirit sword realm to sacrifice their own lives in exchange for greater power. After successfully synchronizing with the Muramesa, some very rational sword bearers also very confidently announced to outsiders that they would never use their own blood and life to strengthen the Muramesa's attack, nor would they roll in the sheets with the Muramesa. As a result, in the end, these sword bearers all went back on their words and madly used their own blood and essence to permanently strengthen the Muramesa. Later, according to the memories of these sword bearers, after they got the Muramesa, they simply could not resist the temptation of the Muramesa. In the end, they rolled in the sheets with the Muramesa and offered their own blood and essence. Chapter 1089. These 2 spiritual sword-level sword mothers were the best among the spiritual sword-level sword mothers in Yuzhang City. The other spiritual sword-level sword mothers were all very mediocre. Guhan could only choose one from these 2 spiritual sword-level sword mothers. If he chose Immortal Sword, then Guhan would simply break through the realm. In the following battles, he would still have to rely on the famous sword-level sword mothers. But in the future, if Guhan fought with Yuan Ko of the Heavenly Court and Mount Lingshan, Guhan would undoubtedly have a huge advantage. If Guhan chose Demon Blade Muramesa, then when Guhan became a spiritual sword-level sword holder and rolled in bed with Muramesa, his strength would probably have an extremely terrifying increase. A 15 times increase in attack power was not a joke. Moreover, Guhan's body had been strengthened by the 6 Revolutions elixir, and was far stronger than the body of an ordinary sword holder. Maybe he wouldn't have to bear the curse of Demon Blade Muramesa. Guhan actually didn't mind rolling in bed with Demon Blade Muramesa. It was no big deal to just visit a prostitute, but the problem was that if this curse came true for Guhan, then it would be a little troublesome. Guhan was determined to leave a descendant for the Gu family. Guhan seemed to have forgotten that he already had a descendant. Wasn't Gu Xuanwu Guhan's biological daughter? But for now, the biggest problem with choosing Demon Blade Muramesa was that Guhan wasn't Guhan now, but Gu Xianyuan Yuan. When the 2 women were together, they could only be lesbians. Guhan couldn't use his blood and essence to strengthen Demon Blade Muramesa at all. In this case, Demon Blade Muramesa's effect was not as good as some other sword mothers. Just as Guhan was in a dilemma over this, the Qingpin sword in the scabbard suddenly jumped out on its own without Guhan actively releasing it. This was because when Gohan was in Yuzhang City, this sword lady, who liked to live in the infant pouch, was known to many people in Yuzhang City. In fact, many people in Yuzhang City knew that Gohan's ancient sword lady was the Qingpin sword, the treasure sword lady was the heavenly sword, and the famous sword lady was the Juzi sword. Moreover, the appearance of these sword ladies was also known to the curious people of Yuzhang City. Therefore, in order to ensure that his identity as Gu Xian Yuan would not be exposed because of his sword ladies, after he transformed into Gu Xian Yuan, all of Gohan's sword ladies were forced to stay in their scabbards by Gun. However, Qing Pin disobeyed Gohan's order and jumped out of the scabbard. Gohan, you want to synchronize with your spirit sword lady, right? Qing Pin bit her lips and said to Gohan with a rare expression full of hesitation and confusion. Gohan had never seen Qing Pin, this simple-minded cute guy, show such an expression. Are you Qingping or Qingpin? Seeing Qingpin show such a rare expression, Gohan began to wonder if the one in front of him was the Qingping sword. I'm not her, Qingpin immediately said in a panic, and at the same time, covered Gohan's mouth with her little hand. Don't mention her name or I'm afraid she will wake up. I know. Gohan nodded. At this moment, Gohan believed that the one in front of him was still his precious sword lady, the cute Qingpin sword, and not that annoying Qingping sword. Gohan, listen to me. If you really want to defeat her, and the two of us can live happily ever after, you must coordinate with her at the same time. Qing Jian quickly said. Her? What her are you talking about? Gohan was startled. Why was the poor acting so mysteriously today? She is very powerful, and the only sword lady that this deity is afraid of. I shouldn't have told you about her. She shouldn't have come out again. This will completely destroy this deity's plan. However, Qingpin can't bear for Gohan to die, and Qingpin doesn't want Gohan to die either. So, Gohan, you must synchronize with her. This way, you might be able to destroy this deity's plan, destroy the plan of the person behind this deity, and then the two of us can be together forever. The poor girl hugged Gu Xian Yuan, and her face was stuck between Gu Xian Yuan's twin peak. Coupled with the forever and ever together, such a child was simply the most beautiful lily blockbuster of the century between a lowly and an older sister. Who is she? Hearing Qingpin say this, Gohan became even more curious. Gohan, do you remember where you found me? Qingpin said again. I found you. You mean the sword burial land? Gohan suddenly recalled the moment when he and Qingpin met for the first time. At that time, he was preparing to synchronize an ancient sword's strongest sword lady. In the end, he encountered Liuyan Ling, who came to Sword Pavilion to synchronize the Yi-Xian sword, and entered Sword Pavilion's most mysterious sword burial land. It was in the sword burial land that Liuyan Ling obtained the Yi-Xian sword, and Gohan obtained the Qingpin sword. At the same time, Gohan and Liuyan Ling formed an inexplicable fate, and he also met the person who treated Gohan the best in his life, Gohan's master, Liu Lei. Now that he thought about it, the sword burial land was the most important place that changed Gohan's fate. He didn't expect that Qingpin would mention this place again at this moment. Go to the sword burial land quickly. She's in the sword burial land. I can sense that she's recovered a little, but she hasn't fully recovered yet. Now is the best time to synchronize with her. If you miss this chance, Gohan, you might not be able to synchronize with her for the rest of your life, Qingpin's sword said anxiously. Got it. Gohan nodded and leaped down from the 4th floor. He ignored the sword ladies who kept throwing flirtatious glances at Gohan and walked to the deepest part of Sword Pavilion's 1st floor. He gently pressed a button on the wall, and the door to the sword burial land opened once again. Almost 4 years had passed, but there were still no obvious changes to the sword burial land. It was still a desolate desert. Countless sword maidens were stuck in the desert, and the entire space was filled with a sorrowful emotion. The dim light from the incandescent lamps made the feelings of love even more sorrowful. There's no sword affinity. Gohan sensed around the sword burial land and realized that there was no sword affinity. Based on how much a spirit sword lady liked him, if there was a spirit sword lady in the sword burial land that had recovered, then Gohan would definitely be able to sense the sword affinity. Gohan, come with me. Chinpin suddenly ran towards the depths of the sword burial land. Gohan hurriedly chased after Chinpin. When the two of them reached the deepest part of the sword burial land, Chinpin suddenly stopped and stomped on the desert beneath his feet. Finally, he said to Gohan with certainty, "Here, she's right here. Gohan, hurry up and dig her out. She's right here." This place. Gohan couldn't help but feel a little surprised as he looked around. The other parts of the sword burial land were densely packed with sword ladies. He would encounter a sword lady almost every 2 steps. However, there wasn't a single sword mistress in this place. It was as if there was something here that the broken swords were extremely afraid of. All the broken swords had collectively avoided this place, leaving an empty space about 20 meters in diameter in the sword burial grounds. This feeling was as if there was suddenly an empty space of tens of square kilometers in the center of Yanjing City, where every inch of land was extremely expensive. There was not a single house in this empty space. It was as if all the developers were afraid of this empty space and did not dare to build anything on it. Could it be the she that Chinpin mentioned? That's why these broken swords are so afraid of her? Even though they're already broken, they still deliberately avoid this place. A few terrifying thoughts popped up in Gohan's mind, but he quickly threw these thoughts aside and began to dig in this empty space. Gohan didn't know how long he had been digging for. He only knew that even with his meteor stage Yuan-Ko body, he couldn't help but feel a little tired, but he still couldn't find any trace of the she that Chinpin mentioned. Chinpin, could the she you mentioned not be here? We can't waste any more time in the sword pavilion. The dimensional protection system in the core area of Yuzhong City might be broken. Gohan said impatiently. No. She's here, I can feel it, but she's hiding from you. She doesn't want to be synchronized with you. Chinpin said to Gohan after closing his eyes to sense for a while. And Chinpin's words made Gohan's heart couldn't help but feel a chill. This sword lady obviously didn't have synchronization. She was clearly buried deep in the desert, but she could still move freely and avoid him. What kind of sword lady was this? But it feels a bit similar to the Xianyuan sword. She can also jump and talk without synchronization. But the Xianyuan sword is an emperor sword lady. The she that Chinpin mentioned can't also be an emperor sword lady. Otherwise, how can a spirit sword rank sword wielder synchronize with her? Just as Gohan was thinking about this, Chinpin suddenly said in a solemn and formal tone that didn't seem like a little lowly's. I'm Chinpin. Don't hide. What's the use of hiding? Do you want to hide until the world is destroyed? Chinpin seemed to be talking to the sword lady, but the sword lady didn't respond. It was as if Chinpin was singing a one-man show. We were originally the best sisters. I didn't want that to happen. I know you don't believe me. In fact, I don't believe me either. I'm just a personality that the main body created. I was only born to die, and I shouldn't have interfered in the matters between you and the original body. But now I have someone I cherish, and I want to be with him forever, until the end of this world. I beg you, come out and help me. When Gohan heard Chinpin's words, he couldn't help but feel sour. It turned out that this cute girl also liked him. Unfortunately, the other party still didn't answer. Come out. You've already missed it once. Do you want to miss it a second time? Can you really let go of the obsession in your heart? Believe me, as long as I'm here, as long as Gohan is here, we still have a glimmer of hope. You still have a glimmer of hope in the world. Those sages can forget about returning to this world. This is your only hope. Do you really want to let him miss it? Is there really hope? This time, it was no longer silence. Instead, it turned into a powerless and helpless sigh. There is. Chinpin nodded. There definitely is. Gohan is our hope. Fine. I'm just risking my life. I'm not afraid of breaking again. As the voice faded, the surrounding desert began to churn continuously. Finally, a slender and simple longsword slowly rose from the desert like a lotus flower. Chapter 1090. Slayer's Sword. Gohan couldn't help but blurt out when he saw the mysterious sword Maiden rising from the desert. It couldn't be helped, Slayer's Sword was one of the most famous sword mistresses in human history. In history, Slayer's Sword had only synchronized with its wielder once, and its wielder was Blood Cuckoo Jindi. It was said that Blood Cuckoo Jindi, who was a spiritual sword wielder, encountered Slayer's Sword in an extremely dangerous place that Blood Cuckoo Jindi was never willing to mention again. At that time, Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit was being hunted by a powerful enemy, and its famed and spiritual sword wielder were broken one after another. After encountering Slayer's Sword, Blood Cuckoo Jindi, who had more than 1,000,000 quarks of sword elements, did not have the ability to synchronize with Slayer's Sword. Slayer's Sword did not acknowledge this wielder. Helpless, Blood Cuckoo Jindi could only temporarily use Slayer's Sword's blade to fight. In the end, when Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit was on the brink of death, Slayer's Sword somehow acknowledged Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit. In an instant, it completed the synchronizing process with Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit, and then went on a killing spree, bringing Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit out of that dangerous place. From then on, Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit became Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit, and Slayer's Sword became Blood Cuckoo's immortal sword wielder. With this Slayer's Sword, Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit became the most powerful immortal sword wielder. At that time, none of the immortal sword wielder was a match for Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit. No immortal sword wielder could last more than 10 minutes under Blood Cuckoo sword spirit's Slayer's Sword. Thus, Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit ascended to the throne and became Blood Cuckoo Jindi. However, in the Battle of the Alps, the Blood Cuckoo Sword Emperor, who fought until the end, couldn't escape her fate. The powerful exterminating immortal sword was forcibly broken under the joint attack of 3 desolate-level Yuan bandits. The Blood Cuckoo Sword Emperor's blood spilled on the battlefield and almost died in the Alp. If not for her son, Jioi Jindi, risking his life to save Blood Cuckoo Jindi, the humans would have lost 2 Jindi. Then, because of the sudden sword aura that surpassed the immortal sword wielder, the Battle of the Alps came to a dramatic end. Blood Cuckoo Jindi returned to Fleeting Time Mountain with the fragments of the Slayer's Sword. She rarely left Fleeting Time Mountain. When Blood Cuckoo Jindi ascended, the fragments of the Slayer's Sword were nowhere to be found. It seemed like Blood Cuckoo Jindi had sent the celestial sword to the sword burial ground in hopes of using the mysterious power of the sword burial ground to repair the precious immortal sword wielder. The Battle of the Alps was the most tragic battle in human history. It was also a battle that concerned the fate of humankind. Hence, every detail of the Battle of the Alps had been studied countless times. The crucial Slayer's Sword was naturally the focus of the research. There were countless pictures of the Slayer's Sword on the internet. Hence, it was not strange that Gohan could recognize the Slayer's Sword at a glance. On the contrary, it would be strange if Gohan could not recognize it. It was worth mentioning that Blood Cuckoo Jindi broke her ancient sword wielder when she was a treasured sword. When she was a famed sword, she broke her treasured sword wielder. When she was a spiritual sword, she broke her famed sword wielder and then spiritual sword wielder. In the end, when she was an emperor sword, she broke her immortal sword wielder. Hence, when Blood Cuckoo Jindi ascended, she only had an emperor sword wielder. Hence, Blood Cuckoo Jindi earned the nickname Sword Wielder Terminator for the first time in history. However, Gohan was curious. Blood Cuckoo Jindi was a sword wielder who belonged to Yanjing City. Why didn't she place the Slayer's Sword in Yanjing City's sword burial grounds? Instead, she placed it in Yuzhong City's sword burial grounds, which had nothing to do with her. That's not right. Looking at the Execution Immortal Sword, Gohan could not help but frown, What I want to synchronize with now is a spirit sword grade sword Maiden. This execution immortal sword is an immortal grade sword Maiden. How can I synchronize with it? Furthermore, my immortal sword wielder already has the sword of victory. I can't synchronize with a second immortal sword wielder. It's fine. My strength has only recovered by half. Now I'm a spiritual sword wielder. You just need to hold me. You don't have to worry too much. The Slayer sword said calmly. A spiritual sword wielder could actually speak without synchronizing with it. This was really too strange. Furthermore, wasn't the level of a sword wielder unchanging? Even if an immortal sword wielder broke, it would still be an immortal sword wielder. How could its level continuously change with the recovery of some strength? This simply went against the common sense of the sword wielder. However, Gohan thought of many things that had happened to him, especially when he thought about how he was only a famed sword wielder but had 6 sword wielder. It seemed like he was even more against the common sense of the sword wielder than the Slayer sword. Since the Slayer sword said that it could synchronize with Gohan, then Gohan had nothing else to say. He just had to give it a try. Even if he could not synchronize successfully, there would not be any loss. Thus, Gohan quickly walked to the side of the Slayer sword. He stretched out his right hand and held onto the hilt of the Slayer sword. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 1 minute. 5 minutes. A long time passed. There was no change between Gohan and the Slayer sword. According to common sense, the success of the synchronization between the sword wielder and the sword mistress depended on the first minute of contact. Some people started synchronizing the moment they made contact, while others needed to wait dozens of seconds before they could start synchronizing. However, these dozens of seconds were never longer than a minute. Now that Gohan had held the Slayer sword for a full 5 minutes, there was still no change between the two. This fact clearly showed that Gohan could not synchronize with the Slayer sword. Everything was just Chingpin's wishful thinking. Impossible. How can Gohan not synchronize with you? Chingpin muttered to himself in disbelief. Don't ask me. I've already tried my best to suppress my inner restraint toward her. The Slayer sword's calm tone was filled with confusion. Clearly, it could not understand why the synchronization did not succeed. Forget it. Since it didn't succeed, forget it. I'll go synchronize with Demon Blade Village. Gohan sighed. It seemed like he was not fated to have the Slayer sword. He released his right hand and prepared to insert the Slayer sword back into the desert. However, the moment Gohan released his hand, Gohan suddenly realized that something was wrong. His right hand seemed to have merged with the Slayer sword. Gohan could no longer control his right hand. How can this be? Gohan reached out his left hand and tried to help his right hand release the Slayer sword's hilt. However, the moment Gohan's left hand touched his right hand, he realized that his right hand had become extremely hard. It was no longer a body of flesh and blood, but a hard rock. My right hand has petrified, Gohan said in disbelief. Petrification was not a rare thing for a sword wielder. After all, every time the sword wielder and his sword lady synchronized, the sword wielder's body would need to be petrified once. However, only his right hand had been petrified, but the rest of his body was still a normal person. This had never happened before. Gohan was indeed someone who often went against the common sense of the sword lady. What's going on? Why has your body become so strange again? The Xianyuan sword in Gohan's purple palace started to toss and turn. It seemed like this Emperor sword lady also realized that Gohan's body was in a strange state. This power of habit is so familiar. Could it be? Gohan, are you synchronizing with some sword lady? The Xianyuan sword suddenly asked in shock. Zhu. Xian. Sword. Gohan replied word by word. *CK you old hen. How did you get involved with that woman? The Xianyuan sword jumped in shock and immediately shouted, Hurry up and release my body from the dimensional pocket. I want to see the Zhu Xian sword. Without saying anything, Gohan immediately released the Xianyuan sword from his dimensional pocket. This Emperor sword that had not synchronized yet immediately floated in the air and circled around the Zhu Xian sword in Gohan's hand a few times. Then, it clicked its tongue in wonder and said, "Zhu Xian sword, I didn't expect it to be you. Xianyuan sword? I also didn't expect you to be here." Although the two sword ladies were in shock, the shock of the Zhu Xian sword was obviously calmer than the Xianyuan sword. Its words were still in chaos. "What's going on with you? How did you fall to the point where you have to synchronize with a spirit sword level sword wielder? If that old master of yours knew about this, he would probably be angered to death by you." The Xianyuan sword said with a gloating tone. "Don't mention that person. I have nothing to do with him. The level of sword wielder that I synchronize with has nothing to do with him." The speed of the Zhu Xian sword's speech became slightly hurried. Obviously, the old master that the Xianyuan sword mentioned did not have nothing to do with her like what the Zhu Xian sword said. She didn't care about it at all. "But you, the Xianyuan sword, what do you look like now? Where do you still have the bearing of the treasure of the human clan?" The Zhu Xian sword said sarcastically. "Hee, no matter what you say, I am still the treasure of the human clan." The Xianyuan sword laughed and said, "The two of us come from the same source. You four sisters were only born tens of millions of years earlier than me, and you have occupied more than half of the inheritance of the original source, making me always lower than you. Fortunately, my luck is not bad, and I became the treasure of the human clan. With the luck of the human clan, I can even suppress you. Are you particularly envious and jealous of me? What's the use of talking about the past?" The Zhu Xian sword's flat tone hit a flame. "If you have the ability to defeat us four sisters, then what's the harm in us lowering our head to you? What a joke! I have nothing better to do than to fight you four sisters at the same time." The Xianyuan sword involuntarily said a soft word. It seemed that the four sisters of the Zhu Xian sword had already formed a huge shadow in the heart of the Xianyuan sword. "But the Zhu Xian sword, what's your situation now? Why are you stuck in the middle of synchronizing?" The Xianyuan sword said with some smugness. "I don't know either." The Zhu Xian sword said somewhat helplessly. "It doesn't matter if you don't know, as long as I know." The Xianyuan sword circled around the Zhu Xian sword several times, as if it was dancing excitedly. Beg me, and I'll tell you what to do." Chapter 1091. Tisk. Zhu Xian stopped talking. How could she beg this smug Xianyuan sword? "Can I beg you?" Gu Xianyuan stretched out her left hand and flicked the hilt of Xianyuan sword. "My Miss Xianyuan sword, please do me a favor and tell me what to do now." "Forget it. For your sake, I won't argue with this fellow." Xianyuan sword found a way out of this embarrassing situation, then continued, "Actually, the responsibility for this is not on Zhu Xian, but on you." "On me?" Gu Han was a little confused. "Then why don't you tell me, why is the responsibility on me? Isn't it because you have two sword ladies at every level?" Xianyuan sword circled around Gu Xianyuan. "Also, when you were in the furnace of heaven and earth, it completely changed your physique, so your current body is completely different from other sword wielders. Other people can only have one sword lady at every level, but you have to have two sword ladies at every level. Therefore, you have to synchronize with two spiritual sword ladies at the same time, or else the synchronization process will be stuck halfway, unable to continue. It's actually because of this reason. Gohan did not expect the crux of the problem to be here. Due to various reasons, Gohan had two different sword ladies at Ancient Sword, Treasured Sword, and Famed Sword levels. However, Gohan had always thought that it was a special case. When he reached Spiritual Sword level, he still had to follow the normal rules for sword wielders, and could only have one spiritual sword lady. But now, the special case had become the norm. Now, Gohan had to synchronize two spiritual sword ladies at the same time. Didn't this mean that in the future, Immortal Sword and Emperor Sword levels, Gohan would have to synchronize two sword ladies at the same time? Thinking of this, Gohan started to feel excited. To be able to have two sword ladies at the same time, in addition to the yin-yang sword tactics, Gohan's strength could already surpass almost all of the Gyendi in history. Probably only Kenzu could be compared to Gohan. Good. Very good. Gohan's left hand clenched into a fist. He didn't expect that being stuck in the middle of synchronization wasn't a bad thing, but a good thing. However, Gohan changed his mind and said, "That's not right. All of my sword maidens were synchronized with me, and there wasn't a situation where they were stuck halfway like this. Why did such a change occur this time?" "Good my ass. What's so good about it?" The Xianyuan sword snorted coldly. "Do you think any sword maiden can synchronize with you? I'm telling you, you're in big trouble. The reason why an ordinary sword wielder can only synchronize with one sword maiden is because an ordinary person's Zifu can only withstand one sword maiden of the same level. The second reason is that a sword maiden will never allow a second sword maiden of the same level to appear in their Zifu. If two sword maidens of the same level appear in their Zifu at the same time, then they will fight each other until their Zifu is completely destroyed." Hearing the Xianyuan sword's words, Gohan suddenly remembered the time when he synchronized with the Doyu sword. At that time, when the Doyu sword entered Gohan's Zifu, it immediately fought with the heavenly sword that had already occupied the Zifu. This was an instinctive battle between the sword maidens. Although the Doyu sword and the heavenly sword were both unwilling to fight each other, the sword marks on Gohan's Zifu couldn't stop at all. If it wasn't for the severed black threads remnant hidden in Gohan's Zifu that suddenly came into play and fused the Doyu sword and the heavenly sword's hilt in a straight line, the two sword marks would never be able to hurt each other. Only then would the chaos calm down. And for the first time, a situation where two sword maidens simultaneously appeared in Gohan's Zifu. Even now, the sword marks on the Doyu sword and the heavenly sword in Gohan's Zifu were still connected to each other in this manner. I don't know how your Doyu sword and heavenly sword get along with each other, but I'm very familiar with the other four sword ladies. Although the Chinpin sword is an ancient sword maiden on the surface, her true strength has been firmly sealed. She isn't an ancient sword maiden at all, so she doesn't care about the appearance of a second ancient sword maiden's sword mark in your Zifu. This is just like how a tiger doesn't care about an ant. That's why your Chinpin sword and the past water sword can get along peacefully. And your Juzi sword and Chidian sword situation is a bit special, because Chidian's sword forged a new body for itself in the form of the Juzi sword, and because the two of them were smelted in the furnace of heaven and earth at the same time, they received the nourishment of your flesh and blood at the same time. To a certain extent, Chidian's sword is the Juzi sword's twin sister, and the two of them are your biological daughters. That's why the sword marks in your Zifu believe that the other is one with them, so they haven't fought. Otherwise, your Zifu would have long been in chaos. What the hell is this Xianyuan sword talking about? Saying that Juzi and I are twin sisters is one thing. Saying that I'm Gohan's biological daughter. Then aren't Gohan and I messed up? Chidian sword's face was completely red as she thought about it. Suddenly, a different kind of pleasure appeared in her body. Yes, this was a strong sense of betrayal. Chidian sword's reaction was very strong, but Gohan directly ignored the words, biological daughter, that Xianyuan sword said. Using a piece of flesh and blood to say that she was his biological daughter, then wouldn't humans who had eaten the flesh and blood of countless animals be the biological children of countless animals? This was simply funny, okay? This Xianyuan sword was definitely deliberately saying this to disgust him. However, Xianyuan sword's words also completely explained why Gohan could have 6 sword ladies as a famous sword wielder. Although it was hard to believe that these opportunities and coincidences happened to him at the same time, it was indeed formed under all kinds of opportunities and coincidences. The current situation is that your body must have two sword ladies at the same level, otherwise you won't be able to synchronize successfully, and you will always be in a state of semi-synchronized coordination. But once you really synchronize two sword ladies at the same time, then these two sword ladies will definitely fight in your Zifu. If two spirit sword ladies are fighting, I guarantee that in less than 5 seconds, your Zifu will be completely destroyed, and then in another 5 seconds, your whole body will die along with them. Even if the gods come, they won't be able to save you. Xianyuan's sword continued to say. So I have to find a way to let two sword ladies exist in harmony in my Zifu at the same time? Gohan summed up what Xianyuan's sword had just said, and finally came to a conclusion. That's right. Xianyuan's sword nodded. You understand very quickly, that's the reason, but the problem also lies here. Before you find a way to let two spirit sword ladies live in harmony in your Zifu, you absolutely can't synchronize the second spirit sword lady. And if you can't synchronize the second spirit sword lady, then you can only maintain the current state of semi-synchronized coordination with Zhu Xian. You're saying that my hand has to remain petrified with Zhu Xian until I synchronize the second spirit sword lady, right? Gohan concluded. That's not a big problem, it's just that one of my hands has to always hold Zhu Xian, that's all, it's not a big deal. I can only say that it's not a big deal at the moment. Xianyuan's sword swayed like a pendulum. But don't forget, your current identity is not Gohan, but you, Gu Xianyuan. And your identity as Gu Xianyuan can't be maintained for a long time. When the energy of the 6 revolutions immortal pill in your body is completely absorbed by your body, you will once again change back into Gohan's identity. What will happen if I change back into Gohan? There will be big trouble that you can't imagine. Xianyuan's sword said with some excitement. Gu Xuanyuan's right hand has already fused with Zhu Xian, petrified together. This is equivalent to Gu Xuanyuan's right hand being completely fixed on Zhu Xian. But if the rest of your body turns back into Gohan, then what about your right hand? On one hand, your right hand has to forcibly transform into Gohan's right hand, but on the other hand, Zhu Xian's power has to forcibly fix Gu Xuanyuan's right hand. With these two forces in conflict in your right hand, even if you use your butt to think, you can guess that your right hand is definitely finished. At that time, you might even turn into a pile of stone dregs with just a touch. What's the big deal? I can use the medical pod to get my right hand back. Gohan said indifferently. Wrong. You're very wrong about this. Xianyuan's sword rested on Gohan's neck. Your right hand is not finished under normal circumstances, it's scrapped under the state of synchronization. The power of synchronization involves the origin of your human, it's equivalent to damaging your right hand from the origin, or you can understand it as completely destroying the genes of your right hand. At that time, even if the medical pod's power is 10 times or 100 times stronger, it's still impossible to help you grow back your right hand. You can only be a disabled person for the rest of your life. Disabled person. Gohan muttered in his heart twice, imagining himself becoming a disabled person, and then he decisively found that he could not accept himself becoming a disabled person without a right hand. Don't ever think that being a disabled person is the end. In fact, you can be considered to have successfully synchronized with Zhu Xian, so once you turn back into Gohan, and your right hand that's halfway synchronized is scrapped, your Zifu will receive an irreparable blow. Even if you can luckily save the current sword lady, it's most likely impossible to synchronize with a new sword lady from now on. In other words, Gohan's life has stopped at the position of a famed sword-level sword-bearer. You'll be a disabled famed sword-level sword-bearer for the rest of your life. Gohan's face turned cold when he heard this. If this really happened, it would undoubtedly be a fate worse than death for Gohan. Then what will happen to me? At the same time, Zhu Xian, who had been silent all this time, suddenly asked, "You?" Xian Yuan's sword smacked its lips. "You can be considered to have successfully synchronized now, but once Gohan's right hand is broken, you'll fail. When the two states of success and failure are added to your body, you'll always be sealed between success and failure. At that time, even if your old master takes action, you won't be able to recover. So if Gohan's hand is gone, you can consider yourself dead." Chapter 1092. All right. Zhu Xian took a deep breath, and then asked Gohan, "What exactly is going on with Gohan and Gu Xianyuan? Are you called Gohan or Gu Xianyuan?" Alright, it seemed like this great god still didn't understand what was going on with Gohan and Gu Xianyuan. "Then let me explain." Xianyuan's sword immediately jumped out excitedly. "The beauty in front of you is called Gu Xianyuan, but in a month she will become an ugly man called Gohan." Zhu Xian was silent for a long time and finally said, "Pervert." Enough. Gohan was too lazy to argue with Zhu Xian, because this matter did sound quite perverted. He turned to Xian Yuan's sword and said, "So before I turn back into Gohan, I must synchronize with the second spirit sword level sword lady. Otherwise, my future will be ruined, and the Zhu Xian sword lady will be sealed forever, right?" "That's right, after saying so much nonsense, that's actually what I mean," Xian Yuan's sword said with a smile. "Then, Comrade Gohan, how do you plan to solve this problem?" "I already have a little clue." Xian Yuan's sword originally thought that Gohan didn't have any clue, but unexpectedly, Gohan nodded and said that he already had a little clue. This was out of Xian Yuan's sword's expectations. "Say it. What exactly do you have?" When the execution sword heard Gohan's words, it immediately became slightly excited. Although it was already indifferent to many things, this didn't mean that it was willing to be sealed between success and failure forever. The key to synchronizing with the second spirit sword level sword lady is to find a way to let the sword mark of the Zhu Xian sword lady and the second spirit sword level sword lady coexist peacefully. Regarding this, I have already succeeded 3 times, but the successful experience of ancient sword level and famous sword level can't be replicated, so I can only refer to the successful experience of treasure sword level, which is the method of harmonizing between Heavenly Sword Lady and Doyu Sword. At this point, Gohan paused for a moment. The Heaven-reliant sword and the Doyu sword fought fiercely in my body back then. It was all thanks to the help of the green silk sword that I managed to merge their sword scars together that I was able to resolve their fight. So I think as long as I use the story of Heavenly Sword Lady and Doyu sword, find a green silk slash, and use the power of green silk slash to fuse the sword marks of the Zhu Xian sword lady and the other spirit sword level sword lady together, we can solve this problem. That sounds like a good idea. Although I think it's a little unreliable, the Celestial Slayer sword said faintly, but it clearly approved of the idea. That's a good idea. We just need to find the sever black hair. The Xianyuan sword also praised. Motherf *Ker, what the hell is this? I thought that I would never need to use the black hair severing technique again in this life. Who would have thought that I would still have to look for it in the end? Gohan smiled bitterly in his heart as he muttered to himself. This was not the first time Gohan had to find the green severed hair. 3 years ago, when he had just become a famed sword-class sword wielder, Gohan had also faced a situation where he had to find the green severed hair. He had also learned of 2 hair cutters. One was in the Lunyan family and the other was in the Moscow base city. However, the final outcome was out of Gohan's expectations. Gohan had used the Heaven and Earth Furnace to perfectly solve the problem of the Yu King's Go Jian sword. In the end, the Yu King's Go Jian sword had evolved into the starting point sword. At the same time, he had protected Gohan's famed sword Maiden Juzi sword, which he had synchronized earlier. It could be said that it was a happy ending. There was no longer a need to cut off the black hair. However, Gohan had never expected that 3 years later, he would have to face the same situation 3 years ago. I didn't want to go to the Lun Yen family so soon, but it looks like I'll have to bring it forward. Gohan sighed. Whether it was Liu Yanling, who had completely cut off contact with him, or to take revenge for the Black Tortoise, Gohan had to go to the Lun Yen family again and completely defeat the powerful Lun Yen family. However, Gohan did not have the confidence to completely defeat the Lun Yen family. According to Gohan's original plan, he should have waited until Gohan became a deity-level sword wielder. However, for the sake of the green hair severing technique, Gohan had to go first. Just as Gohan made up his mind to go to Yanjing City to settle things with the Lun Yen family after dealing with the Lightning Dragon and obtain the green hair severing technique, Qinpin suddenly shook his head and said pessimistically, I can't sever the green hair severing technique. Qinpin, what do you mean by that? Why can't I sever the green hair severing technique? Gohan asked curiously. Back then, the green hair severing technique allowed the sword scars of Etienne and Doyu to fuse together because of her help. It was with her power that the green hair severing technique became the glue between Etienne and Doyu. However, she definitely won't help the Zhu Xian sword fuse now. Even if you die, Gohan, and her plan takes a few thousand years, she still won't help. Are you talking about your main body, the Qingping sword? Hearing Qingpin's words, Gohan was shocked. Gohan had always thought that the fusion had happened naturally. He hadn't expected the Qingping sword to help. From a certain point of view, the Qingping sword had saved Gohan's life. If not for the Qingping sword, Gohan would have already died in the trial formation. I was wondering why the green hair severing technique could help the two sword scars fuse. Now I understand. So it's because of your main body. There's nothing strange about that. The Zhu Xian sword also came to a sudden realization. There's no need to think about the green hair severing technique anymore. Once the Qingping sword knows of my existence, she will definitely not help you no matter what. Even though Gohan had 1,000 complaints, he didn't say anything in the end. He hadn't expected the green hair severing technique to be rejected. However, if that was the case, Gohan really didn't know how to resolve the predicament before him. Don't sigh. Who said, there are always more solutions than problems. The Xian Yuan sword's hilt stood on Gu Xuanyuan's head. While knocking on Gu Xuanyuan's head, it encouraged Gu Xianyuan, there's no need to think about the green hair severing technique anymore. However, it's not that there's no other way to solve this problem. At least I, this old mother, have a way. What way? Gohan quickly asked. The key to the problem is that when two spirit sword ladies are in the same Zifu, the two sword scars will constantly fight. Then let's change our way of thinking. As long as we find two sword scars that will absolutely not fight, it'll be fine. The Xian Yuan sword proposed a new way of thinking. Sword scars that will absolutely not fight? Are there such sword scars among the spirit sword ladies? Not to mention spirit sword ladies, even sword ladies of all levels, in the same Zifu, will still fight. Qingping's sword said puzzledly. Other sword ladies are like this, but the Zhu Xian sword is an exception. Zhu Xian sword, don't tell me that you don't know which sword lady I'm talking about. The Xian Yuan sword's voice was like a demon's, tempting the Zhu Xian sword. You're talking about my sisters? The Zhu Xian sword stared blankly, and its voice immediately became low. No, we four sisters have made a vow that we will never belong to the same master again. Do you want the disaster from 1,000 years ago to repeat itself? Tisk tsk. You're saying it as if the disaster from 1,000 years ago has already ended. The Xian Yuan sword said disdainfully. Isn't that disaster still happening now? Isn't this world still living in the suffering of the abyss of suffering? Isn't the sin that we're carrying still not washed away? I say, Zhu Xian, don't get entangled in the past anymore. If you really want to bear the mistake you made back then you should stand up and lead your sisters to end this mistake together, instead of making some bullshit vow that the four of you will never belong to the same master again. If the four of you don't belong to the same master, then you're no different from trash that can't even beat me. The Xian Yuan sword instantly said a secret that made Gohan feel extremely shocked. From the words of the Xian Yuan sword just now, it wasn't difficult to determine that the disaster from 1,000 years ago that the Xian Yuan sword was talking about was the Great Destruction. It was precisely because of that great destruction that this world was living in the abyss of suffering. Could it be that the source of the Great Destruction 1,000 years ago was actually the Zhu Xian sword in front of him? And the sisters of the Zhu Xian sword? What kind of existence was the Zhu Xian sword and her sisters, that they could actually cause the great destruction that almost caused the extinction of mankind? I've never thought of escaping from my mistake, otherwise I wouldn't have synchronized with that woman back then. Hearing the words of the Xian Yuan sword, the Zhu Xian sword was sluggish for a while before faintly saying, "Even if I'm willing to break the vow I made back then, what about the other three sisters? I know that this vow was made by the three of them together." Clearly, the attitude of the Zhu Xian sword had softened. The problem has to be solved one by one. The Xian Yuan sword floated in front of the Zhu Xian sword. You should know that back then, the Yellow Emperor also defeated Qi Yu first, and then conveniently eliminated his old comrade, the Yen Emperor. So let's first solve your problem, then think of a way to deal with your sisters. I don't think you have the ability to convince my sisters, but there's no harm in trying. The Zhu Xian sword slightly trembled, but my sisters aren't schemed and broken like me. They're still at the immortal sword rank. Even if they agree to synchronize with this person, they still don't meet the condition that they have to be at the spirit sword rank like me. That's right. Why didn't I think of this? The Xian Yuan sword's voice was like a deflated balloon, then it powerlessly poked Gohan's head with the tip of the sword. Sorry, looks like you can only be a famed sword rank sword wielder for the rest of your life. Zhu Xian sword lady. Among your sisters, is there a sword lady called Zhu Xian sword? However, Gohan wasn't discouraged, and instead asked back with a slightly red face. Zhu Xian sword. The Zhu Xian sword's body trembled. That's right, she's my sister. How is she doing now? I don't know either. Gu Xianyuan smiled bitterly, but purely in terms of encounters, Zhu Xian sword lady seems to be a bit more unlucky than you. Chapter 1093. Actually, Immortal Extinguishing Sword Lady's story precedes yours, Immortal Slaying Sword Lady. That's why I thought you already knew about her story. Gohan paused, then said a very familiar name. I wonder if Immortal Slaying Sword Lady has heard of the Scarlet Sword Fairy? The Scarlet Sword Fairy? That's a familiar name indeed. Immortal Slaying Sword nodded, then recalled. I remember now. I once watched a TV series called Yanjing Destroyed. I think the Scarlet Sword Fairy's name was mentioned in it. I only watched the last few episodes. In the end, the Scarlet Sword Fairy wielded a famed sword lady and fought countless Yuan-ko. In the end, she perished together with the King of Nightmares. Although the story was rather touching and shocking, the actress who played the Scarlet Sword Fairy's acting was terrible. I didn't want to watch it anymore after a few glances. I still remember that at that time, little fresh meats were popular. In the end, when the Battle of the Alps began, Xue Wan, who hated little fresh meats the most, used her special authority to send Yang Mi, Wu Yifan, and the like to the front lines to perform. In the end, they were hit by Vairocana's Buddha's palm. Not even their ashes were left. Immortal Slaying Sword calmly recounted an interesting history that even Gohan didn't know. Then, Immortal Slaying Sword Fairy, do you know who the Scarlet Sword Fairy's Immortal Sword Lady is? Gohan hurriedly brought the topic back on track. I don't know. I only watched the last few episodes, and the Scarlet Sword Fairy wasn't the main character of the TV series. The plot didn't mention her immortal sword lady at all. At this point, Immortal Slaying Sword suddenly came to a realization. Its voice trembled as it asked, could it be that the Scarlet Sword Fairy's immortal sword lady is the Immortal Slaying Sword? It seems like Immortal Slaying Sword has already guessed it. Guhan nodded. That's right. The Scarlet Sword Fairy's immortal sword lady is the Immortal Slaying Sword Lady. Then what happened to the Immortal Slaying Sword? Immortal Slaying Sword asked excitedly. Sigh. The Scarlet Sword Immortal was too rash. After becoming an immortal sword-tier sword wielder, she hurriedly went to find Yuan Ko for revenge. In the end, she just happened to run into 3 Eternity Yuan Ko's meeting. The Scarlet Sword Immortal, who had just become an immortal sword-tier sword wielder, was defeated by the 3 Eternity Yuan Ko's. Then, she was captured alive. In the end, she was even forcibly brainwashed by the King of Nightmares and turned into a lunatic. Guhan sighed as he thought back to the things that he had experienced with Sword Immortal Scarlet in the game's dungeon, as well as the things that Sword Immortal Scarlet had experienced in real life, and he couldn't help but sigh with emotion. After that battle, the celestial extinguishing sword disappeared. However, he later learned from King Arthur Artoria, who betrayed the Valhalla, that the immortal Demortis sword was broken in battle and treated as a spoil of war. It had been stored in a large stronghold of the Valhalla for hundreds of years. That stronghold is still in the hands of the Valhalla. If I'm not wrong, then the fragments of the celestial extinguishing sword should still be in that stronghold. As long as we attack that stronghold, we can rescue the Lady of the Celestial Extinguishing Sword. Guhan's words revealed a different kind of emotion. After all, his words also involved Artoria. Impossible. That's impossible. Unexpectedly, after hearing Guhan's words, the Celestial Slayer's sword actually said that it was impossible. What's impossible? Celestial Slayer Sword Empress, can you explain it more clearly? Guhan was stunned. The celestial extinguishing sword can't be broken by 3 Eternity Yuan Ko's. The Celestial Slayer sword said with certainty. If this Scarlet Sword Immortal is really in sync with the celestial extinguishing sword, then forget 3 Eternity Yuan Ko's, even 30, 300, 3,000 Eternity Yuan Ko's can't break the celestial extinguishing sword. Isn't that a bit too exaggerated? The Celestial Slayer sword's words astonished Guhan. Even if Guhan reached the level of an immortal sword wielder, facing 3,000 Eternity Yuan Ko's would only result in death. How could the Celestial Extinguishing Sword say that it couldn't be broken by so many Eternity Yuan Ko's? To put it bluntly, didn't the Celestial Slayer's sword also break in the end? Guhan, you brat, don't doubt me. 3,000 Eternity Yuan Ko's really can't do anything to them. Perhaps 3,000 Flood Yuan Ko's are more likely, the Xianyuan sword added with a chuckle. The Xianyuan sword chuckled and added. Since the Xianyuan sword said so, it seemed that it should be the truth. But what was the background of the 4 Celestial Slayer sword sisters? How could their power be so terrifying? And why would the Celestial Slayer sword, one of the 4 terrifying Celestial Slayer swords, break in the Battle of the Alps Mountains? It must be pointed out that none of the other immortal sword maidens had been broken. Back then, if Vairocana hadn't taken out Daoist Jieyin's, the Celestial Slayer sword was immersed in its own memories and unconsciously spoke a little more. But halfway through, the Celestial Slayer sword immediately realized that it had let the cat out of the bag. It immediately said, anyway, the Celestial Slayer sword can't be broken by 3 Eternity Yuan Ko's. Where did you get this information from? Is it really reliable? Well, of course, Guhan's information came from all sorts of information on the internet in his previous life. But after Guhan became the Sword Tower Master, he had also browsed through the official information on Scarlet Jindy. The story of what had happened to Scarlet Sword Immortal at the Martyr's Palace came from her own narration when she had temporarily regained consciousness. As for what exactly had happened, the Sword Commission had no reliable evidence. The only thing they could be sure of was that Scarlet Sword Immortal's immortal Sword Maiden was indeed the Celestial Slayer Sword. And the Celestial Slayer Sword had disappeared without a trace after Scarlet Sword Immortal returned to Yanjing City. As for Artoria's claim that she had seen the broken Celestial Slayer Sword in the Martyr's Palace, that was only Artoria's account. There was no evidence to prove that Artoria's words were true. Forget it. I think that Scarlet Sword Immortal must have encountered a trap specially prepared for us sisters, just like what I did. Scarlet Sword Immortal sighed and suddenly thought of something. She immediately asked Gohan, "Then what about the Celestial Captive Sword and the Celestial Slayer Sword? Have you heard of these two Sword Maidens?" "I've never heard of them." Gohan recalled the memories in his mind and then told the Celestial Slayer Sword with certainty. "At the very least, I've never heard of the Celestial Captive Sword and the Celestial Slayer Sword. I don't think they've been born yet." "That's good. They probably haven't fallen into those people's trap yet." The Celestial Slayer Sword let out a sigh of relief. "Since it's come to this, there's nothing more to say. We'll immediately head to the Martyr's Palace base you mentioned and see if the Celestial Slayer Sword is there. If she's still here, even if I have to risk my life, I must rescue her." "Of course." Gohan nodded. "I'll definitely find the Celestial Slayer Sword and save her within a month. This isn't for her, but for myself. I won't allow myself to stay at the level of a famed sword for the rest of my life." "Then what else is there to say? Let's go now," the Celestial Slayer Sword said urgently. "Not now." Gohan frowned. "Yuzhang City is in danger. I must first drive away that Floodgrade Yuan Ko before I can go to the Martyr's Palace base. Otherwise, the lives of tens of millions of people in Yuzhang City will be in grave danger." "You want to save someone?" The Celestial Slayer Sword suddenly sneered. "How can you save someone in your current state?" "Why can't I save someone in my current state?" Gohan retorted. "Have you forgotten? You're still in a synchronized state with me. During this time, you can't use any other Sword Maidens apart from me, nor can you release any other Sword Maidens. You can't even inject Sword Essence. You can only use me as a Sword Maiden," the Celestial Slayer Sword said helplessly. "So what?" Gohan retorted. "Don't you understand?" The Celestial Slayer Sword was a little exasperated. "I can't release myself right now. I can only hold it in your hand in sword form." "Isn't letting you charge to a Floodgrade Yuan Ko by yourself the same as sending you to your death? In terms of swordsmanship alone, you can't even defeat an ancient Sword Maiden. Even if I give you the Supreme Pangu Sword, you'll only be sending yourself to your death. So that's what you're worried about." Gohan couldn't help but laugh. "Celestial Slayer Sword, please don't worry about this. It's just a silly dragon. It's no big deal." "Bullshit." Hearing Gohan's words, the Celestial Slayer Sword couldn't help but shake a little to show its disdain for Gohan. "Here, I have to say something for our beautiful Gu Xianyuan." Xianyuan's sword chuckled and joked. In terms of swordsmanship alone, Gohan's swordsmanship might have already surpassed your old master's. Speaking of which, your old master's swordsmanship is really terrible. In his hands, you four sisters were only used to smash people. If he liked to smash people, he could have just used 4 huge hammers. Why did he use 4 swords? The Celestial Slayer Sword stopped talking. It really didn't know how to complain about its old master's swordsmanship, nor did it know if it should. Gohan tried to inject his sword essence into the Celestial Slayer Sword through his petrified right hand. Originally, Gohan was worried that his petrified right hand wouldn't be able to inject sword essence, which would be a huge problem. However, it seemed like the result was still good. The sword essence could still be injected into the Celestial Slayer Sword through his petrified right hand. Gohan casually swung his hand, and a stream of sword aura shot out from the Celestial Slayer Sword's blade. Then, the sword aura directly hit the stone walls around the sword burial ground. The entire stone wall let out a loud noise, and an area the size of 3 rooms and 2 halls suddenly appeared in the sword burial grounds, as well as a ground that had been burnt black. Oh my God! Looking at the charred black soil, Gohan was so shocked that his jaw almost dropped. Gohan swore to the heavens that he had only injected 100 quarks of sword essence. Even if Gohan released this kind of sword essence with his most powerful Qi-Dian sword, it would at most cause a deep wound on the wall. How could it be like this, where a mere 100 quarks of sword essence was able to dig out a space of 3 rooms and 2 halls? Speaking of which, how are your basic attributes, Celestial Slayer Sword? Gohan suddenly realized that he still didn't know the various attributes and skills of the Celestial Slayer Sword. Chapter 1094. Although the Immortal Eradication Sword had been synchronized once, Blood Cuckoo Jindi had never announced the Immortal Eradication Sword's attribute. There was also no information about the Immortal Eradication Sword in the official database. Therefore, if Gohan wanted to see the Immortal Eradication Sword's basic attributes, he had to scan it again. The easiest way to find out the attributes of a brand new Sword Maiden was to bring the Sword Maiden into Sword Maiden Online. The game would scan the Sword Maiden's soul and obtain the Sword Maiden's data. However, this data wasn't accurate. Players had to constantly battle in the game and constantly collect data to slowly adjust. The second method was to use professional equipment to scan the Sword Maiden. This way, the data obtained from the Sword Maiden would be more accurate than a simple in-game scan. That being said, it was complicated to build such professional equipment and the materials needed were rare. Only the Sword Pavilion would be equipped with such equipment in every base city. After Gohan left the Sword Tomb with the Executioner Sword, he immediately brought the Executioner Sword to the scanner. Because this device was created more than 300 years ago, and there was no such thing as high-level intelligence in that era, the activation method was not through personal terminals, but through the DNA of authorized users in the Sword Pavilion. As the former Pavilion Master of the Sword Pavilion, even though Gohan had stepped down, he still had the authority to activate the device. Therefore, he quickly used the device to scan the Immortal Demise Sword. Normally, it would take around 10 minutes to scan a Sword Maiden, but Zhu Xian's sword's scan took a full 30 minutes. Just when Gohan felt that this extremely precious machine might be damaged due to overheating and was about to forcefully shut it down to stop the scan, the machine finally gave the scan result. Immortal Slaying Sword. Material, undetectable. Origin, innate, unknown, unique. Realm, grade, 9th grade sword Dao, killing Dao. Path of massacre characteristic 1. Slaying immortal sword possesses the ability to continuously improve itself, limit unknown. Killing path special trait 2. Deals 150% to 1000% damage to all creatures higher than Dragon class. Deals 15% to 90% damage to creatures lower than Dragon class. Depends on the enemy's realm and attribute. Awakened. Form, sword form. The sword wielder? Deep sword mark. Not deep. Damage ratio. Sword maiden form? Sword form 20? Guardian. Sword maiden form? Sword form 0? Agility. Sword maiden form? Sword form 6. Shield reset time, none. Durability. 100% synchronization coordination sword element requirement. 1000000 synchronization time requirement. Initial sword mark engraving. After the initial sword mark is engraved, the wielder's sword element points will be increased by 100,000 points. Sword Scar Contract 1. A sword scar of the same origin appears in the Purple Palace, doubling the effect of the killing Dao. Sword Scar Contract 2. Basic skills, passive skill, advanced skill, ultimate skill, Sword Scar Restraint, EA. born noble, belongs to the same wielder as the Xianyuan sword. In battle, 50% of the Xianyuan sword's attributes will be added to the celestial slaying sword. Looking at the scan results, Gohan didn't know what to say. No wonder the scan lasted for 30 minutes. It turned out that there were many things that didn't have the final scan results and could only be replaced with a simple greeting. First of all, the Sword Maiden's realm was a question mark. However, Gohan could understand this because the Celestial Slaying Sword was originally a Sword Maiden at the Celestial Sword level. Now that it had fallen to the Spirit Sword level, its foundation was still at the Celestial Sword level. Therefore, the machine that didn't understand it could only give a question mark. The Killing Dao's characteristic was unexpectedly the same as the starting point sword. They both had two characteristics. One of the characteristics was similar to the starting point sword's characteristic. They both had the extremely rare ability to increase one's own level. However, the starting point sword clearly stated that it could be upgraded to the Emperor Sword level, but the limit of the Celestial Slaying Sword was unknown. Perhaps the Celestial Slaying Sword could be upgraded back to its original Celestial Sword level, or it could be upgraded to the Emperor Sword level like the starting point sword. In the end, it might surpass the limit of the Emperor Sword and become the legendary Sword Maiden that surpassed the Emperor Sword. The second characteristic of the Celestial Slaying Sword was the rare increase in damage to high-level Yuan Ko. In Gohan's mind, there were more than 1,000 Sword Maidens data. There were also dozens of skills that increased damage based on the enemy's realm. However, Gohan could guarantee that all the characteristics in these dozens of Sword Maidens would increase damage to Yuan Ko, who was lower than a certain level, and decrease damage to Yuan Ko, who was higher than a certain level. In other words, the lower the enemy's level, the higher the damage. However, there had never been a Sword Maiden with the same attributes as the Celestial Slaying Sword. The higher the enemy's level, the higher the damage, but the lower the enemy's level, the lower the damage. Of these two types of Sword Maidens, the former was specially used to bully children, while the latter was specially used to challenge the strong. The stronger one's opponent was, the more power the Celestial Slaying Sword could unleash. To Gohan, this was simply a top-grade Sword Maiden bestowed by the heavens. Then, there was the comparison of the basic attributes of the three Sword Maidens. Perhaps because they were not completely synchronized, the basic attributes of the Celestial Slaying Sword's Sword Maiden form could not be detected. That was understandable. However, what was up with the basic attributes of the sword form? The sword form's attack ratio was actually 20. One must know that Chidian's sword, as the strongest sword-grade Sword Maiden, had an attack ratio of only 3.85. The Celestial Slaying Sword's attack ratio was actually 7 times that of Chidian's sword. It was no wonder that the sword Chi could directly destroy 3 rooms and 2 halls. The Celestial Slaying Sword's attack ratio was simply not on the same level as Chidian's sword. According to what Gohan knew, the strongest attack ratio among all the spiritual sword-grade Sword Maidens was 4.01, while the strongest attack ratio of celestial sword-grade Sword Maidens was 18.26. In other words, the Celestial Slaying Sword's attack ratio of 20 not only surpassed all the spiritual sword-grade Sword Maidens, but it had also surpassed all the Celestial Sword-grade Sword Maidens and entered the level of Emperor Sword-grade Sword Maidens. Although the lowest Emperor Sword-grade Sword Maidens had an attack ratio of 29, the Celestial Slaying Sword's attack ratio was only at the bottom among the Emperor Sword-grade Sword Maidens, but it had still entered the category of Emperor Sword-grade Sword Maidens. If the Celestial Slaying Sword's attack ratio had reached the level of Emperor Sword-grade, then the Celestial Slaying Sword's defense ratio was also a level lower. The Celestial Slaying Sword's defense ratio was actually 0. Combined with the personal shield reset time, none below, Gohan could basically confirm one fact, and that was that the Celestial Slaying Sword did not have a personal shield. Gohan did not know whether it had a Sword Maiden form or not, but in sword form, it definitely did not have a personal shield. The wielder of the celestial slaying sword would use their own bodies to fight. In this way, no matter how shocking the celestial slaying sword's attack ratio was, the wielder did not have any defensive abilities. Once the invisible Yuan Ko got close to them, the wielder would probably be killed instantly. For a spiritual sword-grade sword maiden like this, even if the attack ratio was increased to 100, no wielder would dare to use her. This was because every time the wielder used it, they would be using their own lives as a joke. A sword maiden that could not provide the wielder with a personal shield was unheard of among all the sword maidens. Even when Blood Kokujindi used the celestial slaying sword back then, he had never heard of Blood Kokujindi not having a personal shield. Could it be that this was the after-effect of breaking it? Or when the celestial slaying sword returned to the immortal sword grade, this personal shield could reappear? Well, let's put this question aside for the time being. Other sword wielders did not dare to use it, but for Gu Xianyuan at this time, it was not a fatal weakness. Although the loss of the personal shield did greatly increase the danger factor for Gohan, Gohan was confident that with his own swordsmanship, the opponent would not even be able to touch a hair on him. Even if he could touch a hair on Gu Xuanyuan's body, Gu Xuanyuan's body was gradually evolving towards the meteor stage Yuan Ko's physical quality. As long as he had the physical quality of the meteor stage Yuan Ko, then Gohan would be equivalent to having a spiritual sword-grade sword maiden's personal shield. His safety factor would be greatly increased, and the need for the personal shield would not be so urgent. Not to mention the next series of sword maiden skills and sword mark contract, it was worth mentioning that the celestial slaying sword actually had 2 sword mark contracts. The sword maiden described in Sword Mark Contract 1 should refer to the Extinguish Immortal Sword, Trap Immortal Sword, and Kill Immortal Sword. Every time he synchronized one of them, the effect of the Kill Immortal Sword's terrifying killing path characteristic could be doubled. If all 4 sword maidens were in Gohan's hands at the same time, then wouldn't the killing path characteristic too become 450 to 3000% restrained damage to all creatures higher than the dragon level, and 5 to 30% restrained damage to creatures lower than the dragon level, depending on the enemy's realm and attribute. This was simply to the point where he could kill anything that stood in his way. As for the Sword Mark Contract 2 that was full of question marks, Gohan expressed great anticipation. Gohan had a feeling that this might be more terrifying than the Sword Mark Contract 1. Finally, the only one that was shown was called Born Noble Sword Mark Fetters. Obviously, this fetters meant that the Kill Immortal Sword was born noble than the Xianyuan Sword, so 50% of the attributes of the Xianyuan Sword were added to the Kill Immortal Sword. He believed that once the Xianyuan Sword saw this sword mark fetters, it would jump up in anger and fight the Kill Immortal Sword. To put it bluntly, but in terms of the attributes that were currently scanned, the Kill Immortal Sword had already stepped on the bodies of all the sword maidens of the Spirit Sword Realm and became the number 1 sword maiden of the Spirit Sword Realm, smoothly continuing Gohan's fine tradition of being the number 1 sword maiden of the same level. Just as Gohan was immersed in the attributes of the Kill Immortal Sword, Gu Xuanyuan's body, which had been strengthened by the 6 Revolutions elixir, immediately heard a burst of voices suddenly coming from the entrance of the Sword Pavilion. It seemed that there were a lot of people at the entrance of the Sword Pavilion. Gohan quickly entered the control room next to the instrument and found that the monitoring system of the Sword Pavilion had not been turned off yet. So Gohan immediately pulled up the monitoring of the gate of the Sword Pavilion and found that there were a lot of people standing at the gate of the Sword Pavilion, and Gohan recognized the 2 leading them. One of them Gohan had seen with his own eyes and had fought with him many times. This person was naturally the old guy Shijueyuan. As for the other sword holder, although Gohan had not seen him with his own eyes, he had read all kinds of information about him long ago. He knew that this person was Sword Immortal Ling Su, the sword holder of the Immortal Sword Realm in Los Angeles, and also the current chairman of the Yuzhang Sword Committee. Why did these two people suddenly appear at the gate of the Sword Pavilion? Elder Shi, what should we do if the gate of the Sword Pavilion can't be opened? Sword Immortal Ling Su, the new chairman of the Yuzhang Sword Committee, asked unhappily. Chapter 1095. This door lock is not easy to open. Elder Shi looked at the tightly locked door and said, I know this lock. It's made of Emperor alloy. Once this lock is closed, unless the Sword Pavilion Master comes personally, this door will never be opened. Only Lu Shihua can open the door? Sword Immortal Ling Su's brows furrowed. Why didn't you say anything when you sent her away 2 days ago? Now that we can't open the door to the Sword Pavilion, isn't this a big problem? Do we have to invite Lu Shihua back? What? Lu Shihua was sent away by them? Hearing Sword Immortal Ling Su's words, Gohan finally understood why Lu Shihua was nowhere to be seen. So Lu Shihua was sent away by these people. But why was Lu Shihua sent away by them? And where did they send Lu Shihua? Was Lu Shihua's life in danger? Thinking of this, Gohan was extremely anxious. He wanted nothing more than to jump out and ask these questions. However, Gohan resisted this urge and continued to hide in front of the surveillance camera. He wanted to see what else these two people were talking about, because if Gohan forced them, these people definitely wouldn't tell Gohan the real answer. At the very least, they would hide some things. Only as a bystander, when their guard was at its lowest, would he be able to hear the real answer. We lost contact with Mu Shui and the others yesterday. They should have entered the forest in Sichuan by now. The quantum communication signal in that area isn't very good. We can only wait until they leave Gansu and reach the Middle East. Then we can use the Jerusalem base to restore communication. This will take at least 3 days. Within 3 days, we probably won't be able to contact Mu Shui and the Sword Spirit, let alone bring Lu Shihua back. Shi Juyuan gritted his teeth. Then what do we do? Hearing Shi Juyuan's words, Sword Immortal Ling Su was instantly enraged. Not only is there a flood-level giant dragon that popped out of nowhere, but according to the news from Fort Yuyang, the Heavenly Court, the Palace of Martyrs, and the League of Legends under Yuan Ko are all very active. They are gathering around Yuzhang City. When these 100,000 Yuan Ko have gathered, Yuzhang City will be destroyed. It's exactly as I speculated. Once the super-dimensional defense system at the periphery of Yuzhang City is breached, the forces of the Yuan bandits are all on the move. They are ready to organize a coalition army to destroy Yuzhang City. Hearing Sword Immortal Ling Su's description of the situation in Yuzhang City, Gohan couldn't help but clench his fists. I know. Chairman of the Sword Council, I know the situation facing Yuzhang City better than you do. Just the giant dragon's attack is enough to overwhelm the core's dimensional barrier system. In 2 days at most, the core's dimensional barrier system will be destroyed. When that time comes, we will have to face a sea of Yuan Ko and flood-level Yuan Ko. The destruction of Yuzhang City is a foregone conclusion. Therefore, our top priority is to evacuate all the Sword Emperor family members, the sword-bearers and their families, and the sword ladies in the Sword Pavilion, Shi Juyuan said. These guys. Hearing Shi Juyuan's words, Gohan felt a surge of anger in his heart. The core's dimensional barrier system could still hold out, and Yuzhang City still had a chance to continue fighting. However, Shi Juyuan was already planning to escape. He even shamelessly placed the Sword Emperor family members in front of everyone. Clearly, he planned to let the Sword Emperor family be the first to escape. After all, the first to escape had the highest chance of success. Moreover, Shi Juyuan had never mentioned the word ordinary people. Clearly, in Shi Juyuan's mind, he had already given up on the 40 million ordinary people in Yuzhang City. He only planned to escape with the sword-bearers and their families. What about the ordinary people? Compared to Shi Juyuan, Sword Immortal Ling Su still maintained the most basic conscience of a swordbearer. He considered the lives of the 40 million ordinary people in Yuzhong City. That can't be helped. We've already tried our best. Shi Jueyuan spread his hands. The sword-bearers are the most important capital of Yuzhong City. The ordinary people don't matter. If they die, they die. When Yuzhong City is rebuilt, we can migrate a group of people from Yanjing City. I remember that Yanjing City's 7th ring road is almost full. If we help them relieve some of the population, it will be in line with Yanjing City's wishes. It's not a big deal. You vicious guy. You actually plan to give up the lives of 40 million people. Even Sword Immortal Ling Su couldn't help but be shocked when he heard Shi Jueyuan's words. Even if I don't give up, they will still die here. Shi Jueyuan probably felt that saying such words was very shameless, so he tried to explain himself. We're running for our lives. It's not like Yuzhong City hasn't been attacked before. At that time, it was because those sword-bearers were too pedantic and insisted on bringing the ordinary people with them to escape. As a result, they were constantly attacked by Yuanko along the way. In the end, when they escaped to Yanjing City, only 1/10 of them were left. If all the sword-bearers escape together and don't have to worry about protecting the ordinary people, I believe that at least 2/3 of the sword-bearers can be saved. Sword Immortal Ling Su, you're the savior of all the sword-bearers. As long as the sword-bearers can survive, your base will not be affected, and Yuzhong City can be rebuilt more quickly. Moreover, those ordinary people might be safer in the underground shelter. There's enough food there for them to use for 3 years. As long as we retake the city after 3 years, there might be far more than 1/10 of the ordinary people left alive. This. Sword Immortal Ling Su pondered for a while. Forget it. You're from Yuzhong City, and you don't care. I'm from Los Angeles. Why should I care? You can arrange for the retreat. Gohan didn't think that he would witness such a shameless scene. The 40 million people of Yuzhong City had been thrown underground by these two guys with a few words. These guys made it sound good, saying that they could retake the city after 3 years. But they didn't look at history. Which time in history didn't Yuzhong City rest in Yanjing City for more than 10 years, and only after they produced an Emperor Sword-level sword-bearer did they have the ability to retake Yuzhong City? Based on the current situation, with just these idiots and without Gohan, Yuzhong City wouldn't be able to be rebuilt even after another 30 years. By then, the ordinary people underground would all starve to death in the underground shelter. And in history, every time Yuzhong City retreated, it was all humans who fought together until the end. Then, the ordinary people and the sword-bearers would support each other all the way to Yanjing City to recuperate. Of course, Gohan knew what kind of pain and suffering one had to go through to escape from Yuzhong City to Yanjing City. The first time Yuzhong City was attacked, no less than 10 million people escaped. In the end, only 700,000 people reached Yanjing City. The second time, 12 million people were reduced to 1 million. The third time, 14 million people were reduced to 900,000. Each time, more than 90% of the ordinary people died or were injured, and more than 70% of the sword-bearers died or were injured. This was a song of blood and tears in Yuzhong City. Gohan admitted that if he let the sword-bearers escape alone and didn't care about the lives of the ordinary people, the death rate of the sword-bearers would not exceed 30%. If they were lucky, more than 90% of the sword-bearers would be able to escape to Yanjing City safely. From a certain perspective, this was indeed the right choice. This was because the sword-bearers were indeed more important than the ordinary people. But this way, the people of Yuzhong City would completely lose faith. Even if the population of Yanjing City exploded, it was likely that no ordinary people would be willing to follow the sword-bearers who had given up the lives of the ordinary people to rebuild Yuzhong City. Even if the sword-bearers of Yuzhong City remembered that they had relied on the lives of 40 million people to survive, they would probably feel a deep sense of guilt in their hearts. they would completely lose their recognition of Yuzhang City. When the sword-bearers of Yuzhang City lost faith and the ordinary people were unwilling to return to Yuzhang City, there would be no possibility of rebuilding Yuzhang City. Not only would Yuzhang City disappear forever, but it would also become a symbol of shame in the history of Huaxia. People would use history to tell their descendants that the sword-bearers of Yuzhang City were a group of shameless people who gave up the lives of 40 million ordinary people to save their own lives. I can't be soft-hearted anymore. Gu Han secretly made a decision in his heart. People like Shi Zhuyuan can no longer stay in Yuzhang City. Otherwise, Yuzhang City's eternal reputation will be destroyed in one day. While Gu Han was making up his mind, the conversation between Shi Zhuyuan and Sword Immortal Ling Su was still going on. The most important thing for us right now is to take away the Sword Maidens from the Sword Pavilion. They are the true foundation of Yuzhang City. Without them, Yuzhang City will really lose all hope of rebuilding. We must open the gates of the Sword Pavilion, Sword Immortal Ling Su said firmly. Didn't I say that without Lu Shihua, this lock can't be opened at all? Shi Zhuyuan said with a pained expression. If you can't open it, then smash it. If you can't smash it, then break the wall. A hint of viciousness flashed across Sword Immortal Ling Su's face. This lock is made from imperial alloy. Could it be that these walls are also made from imperial alloy? I can break the wall with one swing of my sword. When that happens, I can just go in and take away the Sword Maidens. What's the point of caring about this lock? You want to break the wall. How can you do that? This is a historical site and symbol of Yuzhang City that has existed for over 700 years. Even when Yuzhang City was conquered, the Sword Pavilion remained unscathed. How can you break the wall and enter? Unexpectedly, Shi Zhuyuan was starting to understand the need to protect the cultural relics and the symbol of Yuzhang City. At a time like this, who cares about the cultural relics and historical sites? Please make way for me. Sword Immortal Ling Su couldn't be bothered to say anything more to Shi Zhuyuan. He walked directly to a wall beside the gates of the Sword Pavilion and slashed at it with a burst of sword intent. This wall that had been built 700 years ago naturally couldn't withstand the attack of a sword immortal. Dust flew into the air and a huge hole appeared in the wall of the Sword Pavilion. I'll take care of all the Sword Maidens. I'll protect the safety of these Sword Maidens. Sword Immortal Ling Su rushed into the Sword Pavilion impatiently. He was determined to control all the Sword Maidens in his hands. These Sword Maidens could be said to be the most precious wealth of Yuzhang City. They were also the foundation of whether or not Yuzhang City could be rebuilt. If Yuzhang City could be rebuilt, then so be it. However, after hearing Shi Zhuyuan's plan, Sword Immortal Ling Su came to a sudden realization. Yuzhang City would probably never be rebuilt again. If that was the case, then he had to control the Sword Maidens. When the rebuilding of Yuzhang City failed, these Sword Maidens could naturally enter the Sword Pavilion in Los Angeles. After all, Sword Immortal Ling Su was from Los Angeles. Chapter 1096. Where are the Sword Maidens? Where are the Sword Maidens? When Sword Immortal Ling Su rushed into the Sword Pavilion impatiently, wanting to store all the Sword Maidens into his dimensional pocket, he was stunned to find that the entire Sword Pavilion had been emptied. All the Sword Maidens in the Sword Pavilion had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only an empty display stand, which told everyone that a large number of Sword Maidens had once been stored here. Who was it? Who did this? Sword Immortal Ling Su yelled loudly at the empty Sword Pavilion. He had a feeling that the person who had emptied the Sword Pavilion was still in the Sword Pavilion at this moment. Keep your voice down, you're making it sound like this is your home. A light and ethereal female voice rang out in the Sword Pavilion. Sword Immortal Ling Su and the others hurriedly looked in the direction of the voice, only to see a devastatingly beautiful woman hovering in the air. Although this woman was wearing a jacket that only men would wear, and a pair of men's jeans, even though this woman was dressed in men's clothing, it was still difficult to conceal her stunning beauty. Even the experienced and knowledgeable sword immortal Ling Su and the elderly Shi Juyuan couldn't help but feel their hearts flutter when they saw this woman, and the delusion of having sex with this woman welled up in their hearts. People of this age and experience had long become indifferent to things like love. What they needed was direct physical pleasure. However, this kind of erotic delusion only lasted for a short while before it was suppressed by these two scheming men. This woman was clearly the criminal who had plundered all the sword maidens in the sword pavilion. And this criminal actually dared to appear before an immortal sword-tier sword-wielder and a spirit sword-wielder so brazenly. This woman definitely had her own trump cards, and they couldn't afford to be careless. May I know the name of this female comrade? Sword immortal Ling Su desperately tried to recall his memories, but he still couldn't recall who this woman was. Since this woman could float in the air, she must be a spirit sword level or above. Although sword immortal Ling Su couldn't recognize the appearances of all spirit sword rank and above sword bearers like Gohan, it was impossible for sword immortal Ling Su not to have any recollection of such a beautiful spirit sword rank sword bearer. However, sword immortal Ling Su really couldn't recognize this spirit sword rank sword bearer. He could only guess that this was a powerful spirit sword rank sword bearer who had just become a spirit sword rank sword bearer. Sword immortal Ling Su's guess was correct. Gu Xianyuan had indeed only just become a spirit sword wielder today. My name is Gu Xianyuan, Gu Xianyuan said with an expressionless face. Gu Xian Fate. Sword immortal Ling Su recalled this name again, and even looked up the information on all the spirit sword rank sword bearers in his personal terminal. He discovered that there wasn't even a person with the surname Gu, let alone Gu Xuanyuan's name. It seemed that this Gu Xianyuan was indeed a newbie who had just become a spirit sword rank sword bearer, and hadn't even had the time to register with the sword committee headquarters yet. Solid. Your surname is Gu. In contrast to sword immortal Ling Su's confusion, Shi Juyuan seemed to have thought of something. He looked at Gu Xianyuan with a look of horror, as if Gu Xianyuan was his mortal enemy. Solid. Shi Juyuan's words reminded sword immortal Ling Su of Gu Xianyuan and the former Yuzhang City sword pavilion lord. At the same time, he recalled Gohan's appearance and compared it with the Gu Xianyuan before him. He discovered that the two were actually 50 to 60% similar. This Gu Xianyuan was like Gohan had become a woman. What is the relationship between this female comrade and our Yuzhang City's former sword pavilion lord, Comrade Gohan? Sword immortal Ling Su asked directly. He was an immortal sword rank sword bearer, so there was absolutely no need for him to have any misgivings about a spirit sword rank sword bearer. If he wanted to know anything, he could just ask. He reckoned that this Gu Xianyuan wouldn't dare to not answer him. Gohan is my younger brother, Gu Xianyuan admitted very straightforwardly. Sword immortal Ling Su nodded to himself. This Gu Xianyuan could be considered honest. He guessed that this Gu Xianyuan was also Gohan's relative. If she wasn't an older sister, then she was a younger sister. There was no other possibility. Then did you take all the sword maidens here? Sword immortal Ling Su's expression instantly became serious and ugly. He questioned Gu Xianyuan sternly. That's right. Gu Xianyuan nodded, still admitting very straightforwardly. Give me the sword maidens you took. A threatening expression appeared on sword immortal Ling Su's face. He extended his right hand towards Gu Xianyuan. You actually dared to steal the sword maidens of the sword pavilion. You'd better return all the sword maidens to me right now. Otherwise, don't forget the rules of Yuzhang City. Those who dare to steal sword maidens will be killed without mercy. Humph. What a joke. Do you two think you're qualified to talk about rules with me? Gu Xianyuan sneered fearlessly. My younger brother asked me to take care of them for him. My younger brother told me that there's nothing good in Yuzhang City right now, nor is there anything reliable. If the sword maidens of Yuzhang City fall into the hands of others, they might end up in some other city's sword pavilion. Thus, he asked me to take care of them for him. When he meets the sword pavilion lord, Lu Shihua, he'll personally return all the sword maidens to her. Gu Xuanyuan's words caused sword immortal Ling Su to feel very guilty. Just as Gu Xianyuan had said, this sword immortal Ling Su was indeed planning to turn the sword maidens of Yuzhang City into the sword maidens of Los Angeles City. His scheme had been exposed by this woman. This made sword immortal Ling Su feel even more infuriated at the same time as he felt guilty. Guhan is no longer the sword pavilion lord of Yuzhang City. What right does he have to order you to take care of the sword maidens of Yuzhang City? Sword immortal Ling Su did his best to suppress the rage and guilt in his heart. He was still trying to negotiate his way back to the sword mother. Besides, your brother is currently a wanted criminal by the Sword Commission. He's a criminal who has committed the most heinous crimes. Not to mention the fact that he's no longer the Sword Pavilion Lord. Even if he was still the Sword Pavilion Lord, he's no longer qualified to take care of these precious sword maidens. Besides, Yuzhang City is in danger now. You're just a small spirit sword-level sword wielder. You're nothing in front of a flood-level sword wielder like Yuan Ko. Only an immortal sword wielder can guarantee the safety of the sword maidens and bring them safely back to Yanjing City. Do you want to watch as Yuan Ko takes away all the sword maidens of Yuzhang City? Sword immortal Ling Su tried very hard to persuade Gu Xianyuan. Unfortunately, it was of no use. Sword immortal Ling Su, do you think I, Gu Xianyuan, don't know what you're planning? And that shameless Shi Juyuan behind you, I won't talk about how he framed my brother back then. Now, I want to ask the two of you, what exactly did you do to my brother's disciple, Lu Shihua? Gu Xianyuan stared at Shi Juyuan's head that was covered in white hair and asked. Lu Shihua, she. Sword immortal Ling Su hesitated. She's too weak. We decided to send her to Yanjing City. Yanjing City is safer there. Send her to Yanjing City, right? Gu Xianyuan was amused by Sword immortal Ling Su's words. Alright, the entire journey from Yanjing City to Yuzhang City is within the range of the quantum communication network. You can contact Lu Shihua right now. As long as Lu Shihua tells me personally that she can entrust these sword maidens to you, I'll give them to you right now. This. Sword immortal Ling Su was starting to regret his decision to lie and say that Lu Shihua had been sent to Yanjing City. Now, Lu Shihua had entered an area where the quantum communication network couldn't cover. How was he going to contact Lu Shihua now? It looks like this woman must have already tried to contact Lu Shihua but found that she couldn't. That's why she's forcing me like this. Thinking this, Sword immortal Ling Su's eyes followed Gu Xuanyuan's arm. He was shocked to find that the personal terminal on Gu Xuanyuan's arm had been damaged. And only now did Sword immortal Ling Su realize that Gu Xianyuan was holding a longsword in her hand. Just now, Sword immortal Ling Su's attention was focused on Gu Xuanyuan's beauty, so he didn't notice the longsword in Gu Xuanyuan's hand. But at this moment, Sword immortal Ling Su suddenly remembered that the longsword in Gu Xuanyuan's hand had never left her right hand. This was not a friendly signal. Who would keep holding a murder weapon while talking to their friends? Only now did Sword immortal Ling Su realize that he couldn't rely on communication to reach a consensus with Gu Xianyuan. He had to first control this Gu Xianyuan. As long as he could obtain Gu Xuanyuan's dimensional pocket, then even if Gu Xianyuan wasn't willing to open it for him, he could just have the city of Los Angeles consume some emperor blood and activate the sword washing pool to forcibly open her dimensional pocket. Understanding this, Sword immortal Ling Su lightly patted the hilt of his sword. A girl in a blue dress, who was as cold as the stars in the sky, appeared behind Sword immortal Ling Su. Gu Xianyuan recognized this girl. She was Sword Immortal Ling Su's sword maiden, Wangshu Jian. Comrade Gu Xianyuan, let me give you one last piece of advice. If you hand over the sword maiden of Yuzhang City now, I promise you can leave here safely. Otherwise, don't blame me for being rude. Although I, Sword Immortal Ling Su, don't like to attack women, when I do, I can be even more ruthless than men. Sword Immortal Ling Su threatened viciously. Nonsense. Sword Immortal Ling Su never would have thought that this spirit sword tier sword wielder would make the first move before he, an immortal sword tier sword wielder, had even made his move. A flash of light like lightning flashed past. Sword Immortal Ling Su's face was already covered in blood. However, this blood didn't belong to Sword Immortal Ling Su. Instead, it belonged to Shi Jueyuan, who was standing behind Sword Immortal Ling Su. This old man, who hadn't even released his sword maiden, also never would have thought that Gu Xuanyuan's primary target would be him. What's more, when an immortal sword tier sword wielder was standing right in front of him, Gu Xianyuan actually had the guts to kill him. When Shi Jueyuan saw the sky full of blood splatter, he subconsciously wanted to touch his own neck. In the end, apart from feeling a sticky, still steaming blood, he didn't feel anything else. Where did my head go? This was Shi Jueyuan's last thought before he died. What a useless piece of trash! Gu Xianyuan wiped the blood off the slaying immortal sword. He's getting old, and he doesn't even have the most basic vigilance of a sword wielder. Doesn't he know that he has to show his sword scars and activate his personal shield during battle? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.